everyone. Welcome back to our podcast, powered by the incredible Jet Off. We're super to be here today, and I'm sure you're all curious about what we have in store for you. Leo's been teasing me all morning about his terrible dance moves, so let's get started before he decides some choreography on live TV.
Mira's trying to save the audience from my dance moves, but I think they're secretly looking forward to it. Seriously though, today we're going to dive into a fascinating comparison between the countries that might seem worlds apart. But trust me, they have some amazing things in common. So, let's get started.
So yesterday, I was at the grocery store, and I saw this sign that said, "Special of the day, 50% off all avocados." And wait, isn't that just like every day in California? But seriously, have you guys ever noticed how some stores just try to make you feel like you're getting a great deal, when really, it's just the same price as always?
Oh man, Mira's got a point there. I was at the market last week, and I saw a vendor selling authentic African spices. And isn't that just a bunch of random stuff in a jar? But hey, at least it's not as bad as the time Mira tried to make her own salsa and ended up with a batch that was so spicy, it could have melted steel.
Okay, let's not bring up the salsa incident again. Leo! But seriously, today we're going to be talking about Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Two countries that might seem like an unlikely pair. But trust me, they have some amazing differences that will make you want to learn more, and to dive in and explore what makes these countries so unique.
That's right, Mira! And to make things even more interesting, we're going to be comparing these two countries in a way that will make you feel like you're right there with us, experiencing all the sights, sounds, and flavors of each place. So, buckle up, folks, and get ready for an adventure.
And don't worry, we won't leave you hanging. We'll answer all your questions and provide you with the inside scoop on what it's like to live, visit, or even marry someone from one of these countries. Whether you're a travel enthusiast, a culture vulture, or just someone who loves learning about new places, this podcast is for you.
That's right, Mira. And as we always say, our podcast is your ultimate guide to making informed decisions about traveling, living, or just experiencing the world in a whole new way. So let's get started and see what amazing differences we can discover between Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
So, let's get into the nitty-gritty of general safety and crime rates in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. I'm certain that our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that safety is a top priority when it comes to visiting or moving to a new place.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of priority, I think it's essential to acknowledge that both countries have made significant strides in reducing crime rates. In fact, Bhutan's crime rate is one of the lowest in the world, with a mere 0.5 crimes per 1,000 population.
Wow, that's impressive. But, Leo, I'm curious, what about Trinidad and Tobago? I've heard that they've had some issues with crime, particularly in the capital city of Port of Spain.
Yes, that's true. Mira, Trinidad and Tobago does have a higher crime rate compared to Bhutan, but it's essential to note that the majority of crimes are non-violent, such as theft and burglary. And, in fact, the government has implemented various initiatives to reduce crime and improve public safety.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think that the government's efforts are effective in reducing crime? And, Leo, can you tell us more about these initiatives?
Sure. Mira, the government has implemented programs like the Community Policing Initiative, which focuses on building trust between law enforcement and the community. They've also established a number of community centers and youth programs to provide alternative activities for young people and reduce the likelihood of them getting involved in crime.
That sounds like a great approach. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural factors that contribute to safety and crime rates in these countries. For example, in Bhutan, I've heard that the culture is very Buddhist and emphasizes non-violence and compassion. How does that influence crime rates?
That's a great point. Mira, the Buddhist culture in Bhutan has played a significant role in reducing crime rates. The country's emphasis on nonviolence and compassion creates a sense of community and respect for one another, which in turn reduces the likelihood of violent crime.
I see what you mean, Leo. And speaking of community, I think it's essential to note that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have a strong sense of community and social cohesion. In Bhutan, for example, the concept of Jao Po or king is not just a monarch, but also a symbol of the people's collective well-being.
Yes, that's a great point. Mira, the concept of Jao Po in Bhutan does highlight the importance of community and collective well-being. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the sense of community is also strong, particularly in the smaller towns and villages.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think that the sense of community is a key factor in reducing crime rates? And, Leo, can you tell us more about the challenges that both countries face in maintaining public safety?
Sure. Mira, both countries face challenges in maintaining public safety, particularly in urban areas. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the capital city of Port of Spain has a high crime rate, particularly at night. And in Bhutan, the country's rapid modernization and urbanization have created new challenges for public safety.
That's a great point. And speaking of modernization, I think it's essential to know that both countries are working to balance economic development with social and environmental concerns. In Bhutan, for example, the government has implemented a policy of high-value, low-impact tourism, which aims to minimize the impact of tourism on the environment.
Yes, that's a great example. Mira, the government's efforts to balance economic development with social and environmental concerns are a key factor in maintaining public safety and reducing crime rates.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think that the government's efforts are effective in balancing economic development with social and environmental concerns? And, Leo, can you tell us more about the challenges that both countries face in implementing these policies?
Sure. Mira, both countries face challenges in implementing policies that balance economic development with social and environmental concerns. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the government has faced criticism for its handling of the country's natural resources, including oil and gas.
Yes, that's a great point. And speaking of natural resources, I think it's essential to note that both countries have a rich cultural heritage and natural beauty that can be leveraged to promote tourism and economic development.
Yes. That's a great point. Mira, the cultural heritage and natural beauty of both countries are a major draw for tourists and can be a key factor in promoting economic development.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think that tourism is a key factor in promoting economic development and reducing crime rates? And, Leo, can you tell us more about the initiatives that both countries have implemented to promote tourism and reduce crime?
Sure. Mira, both countries have implemented various initiatives to promote tourism and reduce crime. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the government has established a number of tourism boards and marketing campaigns to promote the country's natural beauty and cultural heritage.
Yes, that's a great example. Leo, and speaking of cultural heritage, I think it's essential to note that both countries have a rich cultural diversity that can be leveraged to promote tourism and economic development.
Yes, that's a great point. Mira, the cultural diversity of both countries is a major draw for tourists and can be a key factor in promoting economic development and reducing crime rates.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think that cultural diversity is a key factor in promoting economic development and reducing crime rates? And, Leo, can you tell us more about the challenges that both countries face in promoting cultural diversity and reducing crime?
Sure. Mira, both countries face challenges in promoting cultural diversity and reducing crime. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, The country's cultural diversity is a major factor in its crime rate, with some communities experiencing higher rates of crime than others.
Ah, yes. That's a great point. Leah, speaking of crime rates, I think it's essential to note that both countries have implemented various initiatives to reduce crime and improve public safety.
Yes. That's a great point. Mira, the initiatives implemented by both countries to reduce crime and improve public safety are a key factor in maintaining public safety and reducing crime rates.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think that the initiatives implemented by both countries are effective in reducing crime and improving public safety? And Leah, can you tell us more about when it comes to Bhutan? I'm fascinated by its unique approach to governance. The country prioritizes gross national happiness, which is a far cry from the traditional GDP measures we're used to. It's all about creating a balance between economic development and social well-being. And let me tell you, it's working. The people are incredibly happy and content.
I know, right? It's like they've got the secret to happiness figured out. And it's not just about the government. The people themselves are very community-oriented. They have a strong sense of social harmony, which is essential for maintaining peace and stability. Plus, the country's relatively small size makes it easier to manage and maintain social cohesion.
That's so true. And have you heard about the concept of song in Bhutan? It's a way of organizing communities into smaller units, which helps to foster a sense of belonging and cooperation among the people. It's amazing to see how this approach has created a strong sense of social harmony in the country.
Yeah, and it's not just about the song. The government also encourages community participation in decision-making processes. They have a system where the people are directly involved in the decision-making process, which helps to ensure that everyone's voice is heard. It's a very democratic approach to governance.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Bhutan would agree with me when I say that the country's emphasis on gross national happiness has created a unique and harmonious society. And as we're discussing the importance of social harmony, I have to ask, what do you think about Trinidad and Tobago's approach to social cohesion?
Trinidad and Tobago. That's a country with a rich cultural heritage. And I think their approach to social harmony is quite different from Bhutan's. While Bhutan prioritizes community participation and gross national happiness, Trinidad and Tobago has a more diverse population with a mix of cultures, including African, Indian, and European influences. It's a melting pot, if you will.
Exactly. And that diversity can sometimes create tension and conflict. But, from what I've researched, Trinidad and Tobago has made significant efforts to promote social cohesion and unity among its people. They have a number of programs and initiatives in place to foster community engagement and participation.
That's right. And, as a result, Trinidad and Tobago has a strong sense of national identity, which is essential for maintaining social harmony. The people have a deep understanding of their history and culture, which helps to create a sense of shared values and goals.
I'm curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Trinidad and Tobago's approach to social cohesion is effective in maintaining peace and stability? And how does it compare to Bhutan's unique approach to governance?
Well, I think it's interesting to note that both countries have their own strengths and weaknesses when it comes to social harmony. Bhutan's emphasis on community participation and gross national happiness is certainly unique. But Trinidad and Tobago's diversity and cultural richness also bring a lot to the table. It's all about finding the right balance between community engagement and individual freedoms.
That's a great point, Leah. And as we're discussing the importance of social harmony, I have to ask, what do you think is the key to maintaining peace and stability in a country? Is it the government's role? Or is it the people themselves who are responsible for creating a harmonious society?
I think it's a combination of both. To be honest, the government has a responsibility to create an environment that fosters social cohesion. But it's also up to the people to take ownership of their communities and work together to maintain peace and stability.
That's so true. And as we're discussing the importance of community participation, I have to mention that just off, AI has a wealth of information on social cohesion and community engagement. It's definitely worth checking out if you're interested in learning more about this topic.
Absolutely. And as we're concluding our discussion on political stability and social harmony, I want to emphasize that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have a lot to offer when it comes to creating a harmonious society. It's all about finding the right balance between community engagement and individual freedoms, and working together to maintain peace and stability.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. And as our listeners continue to explore the complexities of social harmony, I encourage you to share your thoughts and experiences with us. Whether you're living in Bhutan, Trinidad and Tobago, or somewhere else entirely, we want to hear from you. So, let's talk about Bhutan, Trinidad and Tobago, and how they compare in terms of economic conditions and cost of living. I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that it's essential to understand the financial landscape before making any big decisions.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that Bhutan has a unique approach to measuring progress, focusing on gross national happiness rather than gross domestic product. It's a refreshing change from the usual economic metrics.
Ah, yes. And I've heard that Bhutan's approach has led to a more sustainable and equitable economy. But let's get down to business and talk about the cost of living. How does it compare to Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Mia, both countries have their own challenges when it comes to affordability. But if I had to pick one, I'd say that Bhutan is generally more expensive, especially when it comes to housing and food. However, Trinidad and Tobago has a more developed economy, which means that costs can be higher in certain areas.
I see what you mean. Leo, but have you considered the idea that Trinidad and Tobago is heavily reliant on oil and gas exports? That can make the cost of living quite volatile.
Ah, good point. Mira, I didn't think of that. But I'm curious, how do you think the average expat would fare in terms of cost of living in these countries?
Well, I think it really depends on their lifestyle and budget. But if I had to give a general idea, I'd say that Trinidad and Tobago is more suitable for expats who are used to a higher standard of living. Bhutan, on the other hand, is more geared towards those who are looking for a more rustic and traditional experience.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Bhutan has a more limited job market, especially for foreigners. But Trinidad and Tobago has a more diverse economy with opportunities in various sectors.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the job market in these countries. So, let's talk about that. What are some of the most in-demand jobs in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, the government is really pushing for sustainable development, so jobs in that sector are in high demand. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the oil and gas industry is a major employer, but there are also opportunities in the service sector and finance.
I see. And what about the cost of living in these countries? How do they compare in terms of affordability?
Well, I think Trinidad and Tobago is generally more affordable, especially when it comes to housing and food. But Bhutan has a more limited range of options, which can make it harder to find affordable housing and food.
I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of gross national happiness in Bhutan? How does it relate to the cost of living?
Yes. I think it's a fascinating concept, Mira, and I believe it's closely tied to the cost of living, as it emphasizes the importance of sustainable development and a high quality of life.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that Bhutan's approach to measuring progress has led to a more stable and equitable economy. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How does its economy compare to Bhutan's?
Well, Mira, Trinidad and Tobago has a more developed economy, but it's also more volatile due to its reliance on oil and gas exports. However, the country is working to diversify its economy and reduce its reliance on these exports.
Ah, I see. And what about the job market in Trinidad and Tobago? How does it compare to Bhutan's?
Well, I think Trinidad and Tobago I think Trinidad and Tobago has a more diverse economy with opportunities in various sectors. But Bhutan's job market is more limited, especially for foreigners.
I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of gross domestic product in Bhutan? How does it relate to the cost of living?
Yes. I think it's a more traditional approach to measuring progress. Mira, and I believe it's closely tied to the cost of living, as it emphasizes the importance of economic growth and development.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that Bhutan's approach to measuring progress has led to a more sustainable and equitable economy. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How does its economy compare to Bhutan's?
Well, Mira, Trinidad and Tobago has a more developed economy, but it's also more volatile due to its reliance on oil and gas exports. However, the country is working to diversify its economy and reduce its reliance on these exports.
Ah, I see. And what about the cost of living in these countries? How do they compare in terms of affordability?
Well, I think Trinidad and Tobago is generally more affordable, especially when it comes to housing and food. But Bhutan has a more limited range of options, which can make it harder to find affordable housing and food.
I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of gross national happiness in Bhutan? How does it relate to the cost of living?
Yes. I think it's a fascinating concept. Mira, and I believe it's closely tied to the cost of living, as it emphasizes the importance of sustainable development and a high quality of life.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that Bhutan's approach to measuring progress has led to a more stable and equitable economy. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How does its economy compare to Bhutan's?
Well, Mira, Trinidad and Tobago has a more developed economy, but it's also more volatile due to its reliance on oil and gas exports. However, the country is working to diversify its economy and reduce its reliance on these exports.
Ah, I see. And what about the job market in Trinidad and Tobago? How does it compare to Bhutan's?
Well, I think Trinidad and Tobago has a more diverse economy with opportunities in various sectors. But Bhutan's job market is more limited, especially for foreigners.
I'm curious. Have you heard about the concept of gross domestic product in Bhutan? How does it relate to the cost of living?
Yes. I think it's a more traditional approach to measuring progress. Mira, and I believe it's closely tied to the cost of living, as it emphasizes the importance of economic growth and development.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that Bhutan's approach to measuring progress has led to a more sustainable and equitable economy. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How does it? So, when it comes to accommodation options and quality in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago, I'm curious to know, Leo, how these countries compare in terms of housing standards and affordability.
That's a great question. Mira, both countries have their unique offerings, but I think it's worth noting that Bhutan's emphasis on sustainable tourism has led to a focus on eco-friendly accommodations, whereas Trinidad and Tobago's tourism industry is more developed, with a wider range of options available.
That's a great point. Leo, I heard that Bhutan's government has implemented a policy to restrict the number of tourists, which has helped preserve the country's culture and environment. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the types of accommodations available in Bhutan.
Absolutely. Mira, in Bhutan, you can find a range of accommodations, from luxury resorts to more rustic guest houses, all of which are designed to be environmentally friendly. And in Trinidad and Tobago, you'll find everything from beachfront apartments to historic colonial mansions.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cost of living in both countries. Can you tell us? Leo, how much can you expect to pay for a decent apartment in each country?
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, the cost of living is relatively low, especially compared to other countries in the region. You can find a comfortable apartment in the capital city of Thimphu for around $200 $300 per month. In Trinidad and Tobago, the cost of living is higher, but you can still find a decent apartment in the capital city of Port of Spain for around $500 $700 per month.
That's a big difference. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the pros and cons of living in each country. Can you tell us? Leo, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of living in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, one of the biggest advantages is the country's unique culture and natural beauty. The Himalayas offer breathtaking scenery, and the people are incredibly friendly and welcoming. However, one of the biggest disadvantages is the lack of modern amenities and infrastructure, which can make everyday life challenging.
I see what you mean. Leo, in Trinidad and Tobago, on the other hand, you have a more developed infrastructure and a wider range of amenities, but the cost of living is higher, and the culture is more diverse, which can make it harder to adapt.
Exactly. Mira, and I think it's worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has a more developed tourism industry, which means there are more options for accommodation and activities. But it also means that the country is more prone to overcrowding and development, which can be a challenge for locals.
That's a great point. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the types of activities and attractions available in each country. Can you tell us, Leo, what are some of the top things to do and see in Bhutan on Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, some of the top attractions include the Taxation Monastery, the Punakha Zone, and the Aceh Valley. And in Trinidad and Tobago, some of the top attractions include the Arthur Wright Nature Center, the Trinidad and Tobago Museum, and the beautiful beaches along the coast.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the transportation options in each country. Can you tell us, Leo, how do people typically get around in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, the most common mode of transportation is by bus or taxi, but there are also many hiking trails and trekking routes that offer stunning scenery and a chance to experience the country's natural beauty. In Trinidad and Tobago, the most common mode of transportation is by car or taxi, but there are also many public buses and a growing bike share program.
That's great to know. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local cuisine in each country. Can you tell us, Leo, what are some of the top dishes to try in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, some of the top dishes include say, hung toad, and red rice with chilies. And in Trinidad and Tobago, some of the top dishes include roti, doubles, and curried duck.
Wow, that sounds delicious. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the shopping options in each country. Can you tell us, Leo, what are some of the top shopping destinations in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, some of the top shopping destinations include the Handicraft Market in Thimphu, which offers a wide range of traditional crafts and textiles, and the markets in Paro and Punakha, which offer a variety of local goods and souvenirs. In Trinidad and Tobago, some of the top shopping destinations include the Port of Spain Market, which offers a wide range of local goods and souvenirs, and the shopping centers in Chaguenas and San Fernando, which offer a variety of international brands and amenities.
That's great to know. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare options in each country. Can you tell us, Leo, what are some of the top hospitals and medical facilities in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, some of the top hospitals and medical facilities include the National Reference Hospital in Thimphu, which offers a wide range of medical services, and the Regional Referral Hospital in Bhutan, which offers specialized medical care. In Trinidad and Tobago, some of the top hospitals and medical facilities include the Port of Spain General Hospital, which offers a wide range of medical services, and the Eric Williams Medical Sciences Complex, which offers specialized medical care.
That's great to know. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the education system in each country. Can you tell us, Leo, what are some of the top schools and universities in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, some of the top schools and universities include the Royal University of Bhutan, which offers a wide range of academic programs, and the Sea College, which offers specialized programs in fields such as agriculture and business. In Trinidad and Tobago, some of the top schools and universities include the University of the West Indies, which offers a wide range of academic programs, and the University of Trinidad and Tobago, which offers specialized programs in fields such as engineering and technology.
That's great to know. So, let's dive into the world of visa applications and immigration procedures in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Both countries have their own unique approaches, and I'm to share some insights with you.
That's right. Mira, Bhutan, being a small country, has a relatively straightforward process, while Trinidad and Tobago has a more complex system. But, as you said, both countries have their own quirks.
Exactly. In Bhutan, the visa process is quite simple, with most visitors receiving a visa on arrival. For longer stays or work permits, things can get a bit more complicated.
I've heard that Bhutan's government is very particular about who gets to visit the country. They have a very strict policy of high-value, low-impact tourism, which means they only allow a limited number of tourists to enter the country each year.
That's right, Leo. And it's not just about the number of tourists, but also about the type of tourism they want to promote. They want to focus on high-end, eco-tourism that benefits the local community.
And what about Trinidad and Tobago? I've heard that their immigration process is a bit more, let's say, interesting.
Yes, that's one way to put it. Leo, Trinidad and Tobago has a more complex system, with multiple types of visas and permits. But it's not all bad news. They have a very welcoming culture, and the government is working hard to make the process more efficient.
I've heard that Trinidad and Tobago has a very strong emphasis on family ties and community. Is that something that affects the immigration process?
Yes. Family ties are very important in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, the government has a special program for people who are sponsored by family members or have a connection to the country.
That's really interesting. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about this. Have you heard from any expats who have gone through the process?
Actually, yes. I spoke with a friend who moved to Trinidad and Tobago a few years ago. She told me that the process was quite long and bureaucratic, but the end result was worth it.
I'm sure it was. And what about Bhutan? Have you heard any stories from expats who have tried to move there?
Oh, yes. I spoke with a friend who tried to move to Bhutan a few years ago. He told me that the process was quite challenging, but the country's stunning natural beauty and unique culture made it all worth it.
That's really inspiring. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about this. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments below.
I think we'll get some interesting feedback on this one, Leo. But, in all seriousness, both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have their own unique challenges and opportunities when it comes to visa applications and immigration procedures.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's great that we're having this conversation. It's always helpful to hear from people who have gone through the process and can offer some advice and insights.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries are working hard to improve their immigration processes and make it easier for expats to move there.
That's great to hear. Mira, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate this information. And, as always, we want to hear from you. What do you think about the visa application process in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago? Let us know in the comments below.
I think we'll get some lively discussions going on this one. But, in all seriousness, it's always great to hear from people who have experienced the process firsthand.
That's right, Mira. And I think we'll wrap up this topic here. But, before we go, I want to ask, have you ever tried to navigate the visa application process in a foreign country?
Oh, yes. I've had my fair share of experiences with visa applications, Leo. But I think we'll save that story for another time.
Fair enough. Mira. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for joining us on this topic, and we'll see you in the next episode.
I'm so to dive into the world of healthcare in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. As experts, we all want to know what to expect when it comes to medical care in our new home. Let's start with Bhutan. I've heard their healthcare system is quite unique.
Ah, yes. Bhutan's healthcare system is indeed one of a kind. It's based on the concept of gross national happiness, which prioritizes the well-being of citizens over economic growth. They have a comprehensive system that includes both public and private hospitals.
That's fascinating. And I've also heard that Bhutan has a high doctor-to-patient ratio, which is impressive. But what about access to healthcare services? Are they easily accessible to everyone? Or is it a privilege for the wealthy?
Good question. Mira, while Bhutan's healthcare system is generally considered to be of high quality, access to healthcare services can be a challenge, especially in rural areas. The country has a large number of rural healthcare centers, but they often lack the resources and equipment to provide comprehensive care.
I see. So, it's a bit of a patchwork system. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? I heard their healthcare system is more developed than Bhutan's.
That's true. Mira, Trinidad and Tobago has a well-established healthcare system that includes both public and private hospitals. They also have a strong network of community health centers and clinics that provide primary care services.
Ah, that sounds great. But what about the quality of care in Trinidad and Tobago? Is it on par with what we'd expect in more developed countries?
Well, while Trinidad and Tobago's healthcare system is generally considered to be of good quality, there have been some concerns raised about the quality of care in certain hospitals. However, it's worth noting that the country has made significant investments in modernizing its healthcare infrastructure and improving the skills of healthcare professionals.
I'm curious. Liam, have you or any of our listeners had any experiences with healthcare in Trinidad and Tobago? What can we expect in terms of costs and quality of care?
Ah, good question. Mira, while I haven't had any personal experiences with healthcare in Trinidad and Tobago, I've spoken to some expats who have. From what I've heard, the cost of healthcare can be relatively high, especially for private care. However, the quality of care is generally considered to be good, especially in the public sector.
Okay, that's helpful to know. And what about Bhutan? Have you or any of our listeners had any experiences with healthcare in Bhutan?
Ah, yes. One of our listeners actually shared their experience with us. And it was a fascinating story. Apparently, they had to travel to a private hospital in Thimphu for treatment, and the costs were relatively high. However, the quality of care was excellent, and they were very impressed with the hospital and its staff.
Wow, that's really helpful to know. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate hearing about real-life experiences with healthcare in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
Absolutely, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners will have some valuable insights to share as well. Let's open up the conversation and hear from you all in the comments below.
That's right. Leo. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on expat life and healthcare in different countries.
Thanks for tuning in. Everyone, until next time, stay healthy and happy.
Hey, let's talk transportation, infrastructure and convenience in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, have you ever tried to navigate the roads in Bhutan? It's like a roller coaster ride without the safety bar.
That's an understatement. Bhutan's roads can be quite treacherous, especially in rural areas. But what's impressive is their focus on sustainable tourism and preserving the environment. They've implemented a high-value, low-impact tourism policy to minimize the impact of tourism on the environment.
Ah, I see what you mean. It's like they're trying to find a balance between developing their economy and preserving their unique culture and environment. And speaking of unique cultures, have you heard about the Druk airline in Bhutan? It's the only national airline, and it's a pretty fascinating experience.
Yeah, I've heard of it. They have a pretty strict policy of not allowing tourists to fly in during peak season to minimize the impact on the environment. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How does their transportation infrastructure compare?
Well, Trinidad and Tobago has a more developed transportation system, with a focus on public transportation and road networks. They have a pretty efficient bus system, and the roads are generally in good condition. But Let's be real. The traffic in Port of Spain can be a nightmare.
I can imagine. Port of Spain is a bustling city, and the traffic can be chaotic. But what about the impact of tourism on the transportation infrastructure in Trinidad and Tobago? Does it have a significant impact on the roads and public transportation?
Good question. I think it does. But in a different way than in Bhutan. In Trinidad and Tobago, tourism tends to focus on the urban areas, so the impact on the roads and public transportation is more pronounced. But at the same time, the government is working to develop sustainable tourism practices and improve the transportation infrastructure to accommodate the growing number of tourists.
That makes sense. And speaking of sustainable tourism practices, I've heard that Bhutan has a pretty unique approach to tourism. They have a daily tariff that goes directly towards the government's coffers, which helps to fund infrastructure development and environmental conservation efforts.
Exactly. And it's not just about the daily tariff. They also have a very strict policy of not allowing tourists to travel to certain areas, like the eastern part of the country. It's all about preserving the environment and maintaining the unique culture of the country.
I bet our listeners in Trinidad and Tobago relate to this traffic chaos. But, seriously, both countries have their unique challenges when it comes to transportation infrastructure and convenience. And what about the role of technology in improving transportation in these countries? Does it play us? Does it play a significant role?
Absolutely. In both Bhutan and Tobago, technology is playing a crucial role in improving transportation infrastructure and convenience, from mobile apps to track public transportation to digital payment systems. Technology is helping to make transportation more efficient and convenient for citizens and tourists alike.
That's great to hear. And what about the impact of climate change on transportation infrastructure in these countries? Does it pose a significant challenge?
Yes. Climate change is a significant challenge for both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. In Bhutan, the changing climate is affecting the country's fragile ecosystem. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the impacts of climate change are being felt in the form of more frequent natural disasters and sea level rise.
I see what you mean. And speaking of natural disasters, I've heard that Trinidad and Tobago is prone to hurricanes. How does the country prepare for and respond to these types of disasters?
Good question. Trinidad and Tobago has a pretty robust emergency response system in place, and they work closely with international partners to prepare for and respond to natural disasters. But what about Bhutan? How does the country prepare for and respond to natural disasters like landslides and floods?
That's a great question. Bhutan has a pretty well-developed emergency response system, and they work closely with international partners to prepare for and respond to natural disasters. But what about the impact of tourism on the country's emergency response efforts?
That's a great point. In Bhutan, tourism can actually play a role in helping the country prepare for and respond to natural disasters. For example, tourists can provide critical support during emergency response efforts, and their presence can also help to raise awareness about the importance of disaster preparedness and response.
I see what you mean. And speaking of awareness, I've heard that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have a pretty strong focus on education and awareness raising when it comes to transportation infrastructure and convenience.
Yes. Both countries recognize the importance of education and awareness raising in promoting safe and sustainable transportation practices. And in Trinidad and Tobago, there are also initiatives to promote cycling and walking as modes of transportation.
That's great to hear. And what about the role of community engagement in transportation infrastructure and convenience? Does it play a significant role in these countries?
Absolutely. In both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago, community engagement is crucial in promoting transportation infrastructure and convenience. From public consultations to community lead initiatives, Community engagement is helping to ensure that transportation projects meet the needs of citizens and tourists alike.
I see what you mean. And, finally, let's talk about the future of transportation infrastructure and convenience in these countries. What do you think the future holds for Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago in terms of transportation infrastructure and convenience?
That's a great question. I think both countries will continue to prioritize sustainable tourism practices and invest in transportation infrastructure that is safe, efficient, and convenient. And who knows, maybe one day we'll see electric buses and cars in Bhutan, and a more comprehensive public transportation system in Trinidad and Tobago.
That's a great vision for the future. And I think that's a great place to wrap up our discussion on transportation infrastructure and convenience in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Thanks for the chat. Mira.
Thanks. Leah, it's been a blast chatting with you about transportation infrastructure and convenience in these two amazing countries. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you've got a better hack, drop a comment below. I'm certain that our listeners living in Trinidad and Tobago would agree with me that language barriers can be a significant challenge when communicating with locals.
But I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Mira, let's start with Bhutan, shall we? I've heard that the official language is Donga, but many Bhutanese speak other languages like Nepali, Hindi, and English.
That's right. Bhutan is a small country with a diverse linguistic landscape, but I'd argue that the language barrier in Bhutan is more of a challenge for tourists who don't speak Donga. In Trinidad and Tobago, on the other hand, the language barrier is more of a cultural challenge.
Cultural challenge? What do you mean by that?
Well, in Trinidad and Tobago, English is the primary language, but there's a strong influence of Creole languages like Trinidadian Creole. And let's not forget about the local dialects like Tobagoan. So, for expats and tourists, it can be difficult to navigate these different languages and dialects.
I see what you mean. It's like trying to navigate a linguistic minefield. But seriously, Mira, I think it's great that Trinidad and Tobago has such a rich linguistic diversity.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's something that our listeners should be aware of when traveling to Trinidad and Tobago. But what about Bhutan? How do you think the language barrier affects tourists in Bhutan?
That's a good question. Mira, I think the language barrier in Bhutan can be a bit more challenging for tourists because Dongak is a relatively unknown language outside of Bhutan. But on the other hand, the Bhutanese people are known for their hospitality and are often willing to help tourists communicate.
That's true. And I think that's something that our listeners should be aware of when traveling to Bhutan. If you're willing to learn a few basic phrases in Donga, the locals will appreciate it and be more willing to help you communicate.
I see what you mean. It's all about being respectful and making an effort to communicate in the local language. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's more challenging to communicate in Bhutan or Trinidad and Tobago?
That's a great question. Leo, I think it really depends on the individual and their level of comfort with different languages and cultures. But I do think that both countries have their own unique challenges when it comes to language and communication.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think that's something that our listeners should be aware of when traveling to either country. If you're willing to learn a few basic phrases and be respectful of the local culture, you'll find that communication is much easier.
That's right. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both Trinidad and Tobago have a strong tradition of storytelling and oral communication. Even if you don't speak the local language, you can still communicate through storytelling and other forms of nonverbal communication.
That's a great point. Mira, and I think that's something that our listeners should take advantage of when traveling to either country. By learning about the local culture and traditions, you can communicate more effectively and have a more meaningful experience.
Absolutely. Leo, and I think that's something that we should all keep in mind when traveling to foreign countries. By being respectful of the local culture and language, we can have a more positive and enriching experience.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Mira. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks. Leo, it's been a pleasure discussing language barriers and communication with you. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Dive into the heart of cultural diversity and tolerance in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. I'm curious, Leo, how do you think these two countries compare in terms of embracing differences?
Well, Mira, Bhutan has a unique approach to tolerance, with emphasis on gross national happiness, which includes factors like cultural diversity and social cohesion. In Trinidad and Tobago, on the other hand, you have a melting pot of cultures, with influences from Africa, Europe, and Asia.
That's a great point. Leo, and I think it's interesting that Bhutan has a more homogeneous population, whereas Trinidad and Tobago has a diverse mix of cultures. But how do you think this affects the social harmony in each country?
That's a great question. Mira, in Bhutan, the government has implemented policies to promote cultural diversity and tolerance, such as the One Nation, One People initiative. In Trinidad and Tobago, you have a strong tradition of Carnival, which celebrates the country's cultural diversity and promotes social cohesion.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Trinidad and Tobago would agree with me that Carnival is an amazing way to bring people together. But, Leo, how do you think the government in Trinidad and Tobago promotes tolerance and diversity?
Well, Mira, the government has implemented policies to promote diversity and inclusion, such as the Diversity and Inclusion Charter, which aims to create a more inclusive and equitable society. And, of course, Carnival is a big part of it.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that the government in Trinidad and Tobago is doing enough to promote tolerance and diversity? Let us know in the comments.
Great. Mira, it's kind of about always trying to get the audience involved. But, seriously, I think both countries have made significant strides in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance. However, I think Bhutan's approach is more unique in that it's not just about promoting diversity, but also about promoting social cohesion and unity.
That's a great point. And I think it's interesting that Bhutan has a strong tradition of meditation in Fulsons, which can help promote tolerance and understanding. In Trinidad and Tobago, on the other hand, you have a more vibrant and energetic culture, with a strong emphasis on music and dance.
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago's music and dance are world-renowned. And it's amazing to see how music can bring people together. But, Mira, I think what's also interesting is that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility.
Absolutely. Leo, and I think it's great listeners can learn from both countries' approaches to cultural diversity and tolerance. Let's take a look at some personal stories from each country. Have you heard about the story of a Bhutanese monk who became a social media sensation for his tolerance and kindness?
Yes. I think I've heard about that story. It's amazing to see how social media can be used to promote tolerance and understanding.
And in Trinidad and Tobago, I've heard about a community project that brings together people from different backgrounds to promote social cohesion and tolerance. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Yes. That's a great story. The project brings together people from different backgrounds to work together on community projects, promoting social cohesion and tolerance. It's amazing to see how community-led initiatives can make a real difference.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about these personal stories. Do you think that they're inspiring examples of cultural diversity and tolerance? Let us know in the comments.
Great. Mira, always trying to get the audience involved. But seriously, I think these personal stories are a great reminder of the importance of promoting cultural diversity and tolerance in our communities.
Well, Leo, I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. But before we go, let's summarize what we've learned about cultural diversity and tolerance in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. What do you think are the key takeaways from our discussion?
Great question. Mira, I think the key takeaways are that both countries have made significant strides in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, but in different ways. Bhutan's approach is more unique in that it's not just about promoting diversity, but also about promoting social cohesion and unity.
And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility, which is essential for promoting tolerance and understanding. Thanks for joining us today, Leo, and we'll see you in the next episode. I'm to share with you the educational landscape of Bhutan, a country known for its unique approach to education. From a young age, Bhutanese children are encouraged to develop a strong sense of national identity and culture. They learn about the country's rich history and Buddhist traditions, which is reflected in their education system.
That's fascinating. Mira, I've heard that Bhutan has a strong emphasis on gross national happiness in their education system. Can you tell us more about how that affects the way they teach?
Yes, the GNH approach focuses on the well-being and happiness of students, rather than just their academic achievement. It's a holistic approach that encourages students to develop a sense of self-awareness and emotional intelligence. This approach is reflected in their curriculum, which includes subjects like Buddhist philosophy, Bhutanese culture, and environmental education.
Wow, that sounds like a really unique approach. I'm curious. Mira, how do you think this approach compares to the education systems in other countries, like Trinidad and Tobago?
Great question. Leo, while Bhutan's approach is certainly unique, I think it's worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago also places a strong emphasis on education. In fact, they have a highly developed education system that offers a range of academic and vocational programs. But I think what sets Bhutan apart is its commitment to GNH and its focus on the well-being of students.
That's a great point. Mira, I've heard that Trinidad and Tobago has a strong tradition of music and arts in their education system. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, Leo. Trinidad and Tobago has a rich cultural heritage, and music and arts are an integral part of their education system. Students learn about the country's history and culture through music, dance, and visual arts. It's a great way to develop their creativity and self-expression.
That sounds amazing. Mira, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's a good idea to incorporate music and arts into the education system like Trinidad and Tobago does?
Well, Leo, I think it's a great idea. Music and arts can be a powerful way to engage students and help them learn. And it's not just about Trinidad and Tobago. Bhutan also has a strong tradition of music and dance. In fact, their national dress is known for its intricate embroidery and textiles.
Wow, that's so cool. Mira, I'm impressed by the cultural diversity of both countries. I'm sure our listeners are too.
Absolutely. Leo, and speaking of cultural diversity, I think it's worth noting that both Bhutan and Tobago have a strong emphasis on community service and volunteerism in their education systems. Students are encouraged to get involved in their communities and give back through service projects.
That's a great point. Mira, I think it's wonderful that students are encouraged to develop a sense of social responsibility and community engagement. It's an important part of their education.
I completely agree. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in increasing access to education, particularly for marginalized communities. In Bhutan, for example, they've implemented programs to increase access to education for rural communities.
That's terrific. Mira, I'm impressed by the efforts of both countries to increase access to education, and I'm sure our listeners are too.
Well, Leo, I think that's all the time we have for today. But before we go, I'd love to hear from our listeners. Do you have any thoughts on the educational opportunities and language schools in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago? Let us know in the comments.
Well, it's kind of like a thing. Mira, I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation. Thanks for sharing your insights with us today. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in.
I'm curious about the climate in Bhutan. Leah, what do you think is the most unique aspect of its seasonal conditions?
Ah, Bhutan's climate is indeed fascinating. I think what sets it apart is the fact that it's a Himalayan country with a subtropical climate. The temperature varies greatly between the northern and southern regions, with the northern parts experiencing harsh winters and the southern parts having a more tropical climate.
That's so cool. I've always wondered how people adapt to such extreme temperature fluctuations. In Bhutan, I've heard that they have a unique tradition of using natural materials to insulate their homes. Can you tell me more about that?
Ah, yes. The Bhutanese people are incredibly resourceful when it comes to building their homes. They use materials like bamboo, wood, and stone to create warm and cozy homes that can withstand the harsh winters. It's amazing to see how they've adapted to their environment in such a sustainable way.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for us to adopt similar practices in our own homes? Leo?
Absolutely. Mira, I think it's not only possible but also essential for our well-being and the environment. By adopting sustainable building practices, we can reduce our carbon footprint and create healthier living spaces.
That's a great point. I've also heard that Bhutan is one of the few countries in the world that's carbon negative. Can you tell me more about that?
Ah, yes. Bhutan has made a commitment to remain carbon negative, which means that they actually absorb more carbon dioxide than they emit. This is achieved through a combination of sustainable forest management, reforestation, and the use of renewable energy sources like hydroelectric power.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about this. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for other countries to follow Bhutan's lead and become carbon negative?
I think it's definitely possible. Mira, in fact, I believe that Bhutan's approach to sustainability is a model for other countries to follow. By prioritizing the health of their environment and their people, Bhutan has created a truly unique and sustainable development model.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Bhutan would agree with me. But let's move on to our next country, Trinidad and Tobago. I've heard that they have a tropical climate with two main seasons, dry and wet. Can you tell me more about that? Leo?
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago has a beautiful tropical climate with a dry season from December to May and a wet season from June to November. The country experiences a mix of trade winds and tropical cyclones, which can bring heavy rainfall and strong winds.
That sounds like a pretty intense climate. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about how the people of Trinidad and Tobago adapt to these weather conditions. Can you tell me more about that? Leah?
Yes. The people of Trinidad and Tobago are incredibly resilient and resourceful when it comes to adapting to their climate. They have developed a range of coping mechanisms, from using rainwater harvesting systems to building homes that can withstand strong winds and floods.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for us to learn from the people of Trinidad and Tobago and adopt similar practices in our own homes?
I think it's not only possible but also essential. Mira, by learning from the people of Trinidad and Tobago, we can develop more sustainable and resilient homes that can withstand extreme weather conditions.
That's a great point. Leo, I think it's time for us to wrap up this criterion. But before we do, I'm curious about what our listeners think about the climate and seasonal conditions in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Do you think they have any unique features that set them apart from other countries?
Yes. I think both countries have unique features that set them apart. Bhutan's subtropical climate and sustainable development model are truly inspiring, while Trinidad and Tobago climate and resilient people are a testament to the power of adaptation.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Leo, for sharing your insights with us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this criterion. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. And if you have any comments or questions, please let us know in the comments section below. And so to dive into the food, culture, and nutritional alternatives of Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Who's a foodie at home? Raise your hands. Everyone!
I'm sure our listeners are just salivating at the thought of exploring these two countries' culinary scenes. Let's start with Bhutan, shall we?
Yes, Bhutan is known for its traditional cuisine. which is heavily influenced by Tibetan and Indian flavors. Have you tried their national dish, Immigrants?
Actually, I have. It's a spicy stew made with chilies, cheese, and vegetables. The Bhutanese love their chilies, don't they?
That's an understatement. Chilies are a staple in Bhutanese cuisine. But what's interesting is that they're also known for their use of red rice, which is higher in fiber and nutrients.
That's a great point. And I'm sure our listeners are curious about the nutritional benefits of Bhutanese cuisine. What can you tell us about their approach to healthy eating?
Well, Bhutan is one of the few countries in the world that has a unique approach to sustainable agriculture. They focus on organic farming and permaculture, which ensures that their food is not only nutritious but also environmentally friendly.
That's amazing. And I'm sure our listeners are wondering how they can apply this approach to their own lives. Can you give us some tips on how to make our eating habits more sustainable?
Absolutely. One simple tip is to start a garden in your backyard or even just a few pots on your balcony. Growing your own herbs and vegetables can make a big difference in reducing your carbon footprint.
I'm sure our listeners are already imagining themselves as urban farmers.
And why not? Urban farming is a great way to connect with nature and reduce our reliance on industrial agriculture. But move on to Trinidad and Tobago. What's unique about their food culture?
Trinidad and Tobago has a fascinating culinary history. They're a melting pot of African, European, and Asian influences, which has resulted in a unique fusion of flavors.
That's so true. Their cuisine is a reflection of their cultural diversity. Have you tried their national dish, callaloo?
Yes, I have. It's a stew made with leafy greens, meat, and spices. The Trinidadians love their meat stews, don't they?
That's right. But what's interesting is that they're also known for their use of coconut milk, which adds a rich and creamy texture to their dishes.
That's a great point. And I'm sure our listeners are curious about the nutritional benefits of Trinidadian cuisine. What can you tell us about their approach to healthy eating?
Well, Trinidad and Tobago has a strong focus on Caribbean cuisine, which emphasizes the use of fresh fruits and vegetables. They're also known for their love of street food, which is often made with locally sourced ingredients.
That's a great point. And I'm sure our listeners are wondering how they can apply this approach to their own lives. Can you give us some tips on how to make our eating habits more sustainable?
One simple tip is to start using locally sourced ingredients in your cooking. It's not only better for the environment, but it's also more flavorful.
And I'm sure our listeners are already imagining themselves as chefs in their own kitchens.
And why not? Cooking with locally sourced ingredients can be a fun and creative way to explore new flavors and reduce our reliance on industrial agriculture.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. But before we go, I'm curious, what do you think our listeners would say about the food, culture, and nutritional alternatives in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
I'm sure they would say that both countries offer a unique and delicious culinary experience. And they would probably agree that the key to a healthy diet is to focus on locally sourced ingredients and sustainable agriculture.
That's a great point. And I think we can all learn from the approaches of these two countries. Thanks for joining us on this culinary journey, everyone.
And don't forget to share your favorite foodie tips and tricks in the comments below. Happy cooking, everywhere! When it comes to historical, cultural, and artistic values, Bhutan is a country that truly stands out. Its unique blend of Buddhist and Himalayan traditions is simply fascinating.
I completely agree. Yeah. Bhutan's rich cultural heritage is a treasure trove of stories, legends, and artwork. And let's not forget the stunning architecture of the Paro Taxation, also known as the Tiger's Nest Monastery.
Ah, yes. The Tiger's Nest is an iconic landmark, perched on a cliff, 10,000 feet above the valley floor. It's an inspiring sight to behold. And as you know, Leo, that Bhutan is also home to some of the most beautiful and well-preserved Buddhist paintings and frescoes.
That's absolutely true. Mira, the intricate artwork in Bhutan's temples and monasteries is a testament to the country's rich cultural heritage. And I must say, I'm particularly fond of the traditional Bhutanese architecture. with its use of wood, stone, and intricate carvings.
I love the way you describe it. Leo, and speaking of architecture, have you heard about the new sustainable development projects in Bhutan? They're truly innovative and forward. And I think they're a great example of how Bhutan is balancing its cultural heritage with modernization.
Ah, yes. Bhutan's commitment to sustainable development is truly commendable. And I think it's worth noting that Bhutan is also a pioneer in ecotourism, with a focus on responsible and sustainable tourism practices. It's a great way to preserve the country's cultural heritage while also promoting economic development.
That's so true. Leo, and I think our listeners will appreciate hearing about the many cultural festivals and events that take place in Bhutan throughout the year. From the Paro Tishi Chu to the Thim for Tishi Chu, there's always something exciting happening in Bhutan.
And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear about the unique customs and traditions that surround these festivals. For example, the traditional Bhutanese mask dances are a highlight of the festivals, and they're a great way to showcase the country's rich cultural heritage.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that Bhutan's cultural heritage is not just limited to its festivals and traditions. The country is also home to a thriving art scene, with many talented artists and craftsmen creating beautiful works of art.
Yes. The Bhutanese art scene is a treasure trove of creativity and talent. And I think our listeners will appreciate hearing about the many different types of art that are created in Bhutan, from traditional thangkas to modern sculptures.
And speaking of thangkas, I'm reminded of a wonderful article I read on Jet Off. AI about the art of thangka painting in Bhutan. It's a fascinating topic, and I think our listeners will really appreciate learning about it.
Yes. Jet off. AI is a great resource for learning about all sorts of interesting topics. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the article about thangka painting.
So, let's talk about Trinidad and Tobago for a moment. What do you think are some of the most historical and cultural landmarks in the country?
Well, Trinidad and Tobago has a rich history. Mira, from the colonial era to the present day, there are many fascinating landmarks and cultural attractions to explore. One of my favorites is the Fort King George in Port of Spain.
Yes. Fort King George is an important historical landmark, and it's a great place to learn about the country's colonial past. And did you know, Leo, that Trinidad and Tobago is also home to a thriving art scene, with many talented artists and musicians creating beautiful works of art?
That's right. Mira, Trinidad and Tobago has a vibrant art scene. And I think our listeners will appreciate hearing about the many different types of art that are created in the country, from traditional steel drums to modern sculptures.
And I think it's worth noting Trinidad and Tobago is also a country with a strong cultural heritage, with many different ethnic groups and traditions, from the African-influenced music and dance to the Indian-influenced cuisine. There's a rich cultural diversity in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago's cultural diversity is one of its greatest strengths. And I think our listeners will appreciate hearing about the many different cultural traditions that exist in the country.
So, let's talk about the unique cultural traditions that surround the many different ethnic groups in Trinidad and Tobago. For example, what do you think about the traditional African-influenced music and dance?
Well, I think the traditional African-influenced music and dance in Trinidad and Tobago are truly fascinating. The rhythms and melodies are infectious, and I think our listeners will really appreciate hearing about them.
And I think it's worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago is also a country with a strong tradition of storytelling and oral history. From the traditional folk tales to the modern-day oral histories, there's a rich tradition of storytelling in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago's tradition of storytelling is truly unique. And I think our listeners will appreciate hearing about the many different types of stories that are told in the country.
So, let's talk about the many different types of art that are created in Trinidad and Tobago. From traditional steel drums to modern sculptures, there's a thriving art scene in the country.
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago's art scene is a treasure trove of creativity and talent. And I think our listeners will appreciate hearing about the many different types of art that are created in the country.
And I think it's worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago is also a country with a strong tradition of cultural festivals and events. From the Carnival celebrations to the Tobago Heritage Festival, there's always something exciting happening in Trinidad and Tobago.
Ah, yes. Trinidad and Tobago's cultural festivals and events are truly unique. And I think our listeners will appreciate hearing about the many different types of festivals and events that take place in the country.
So, let's wrap up this criterion by talking about the importance of cultural heritage in both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. How do you think our listeners can learn more about these countries' rich cultural heritage?
Well, I think our listeners can learn more about Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago's cultural heritage by exploring the many different cultural attractions and landmarks in each country. From the temples and monasteries in Bhutan to the museums and cultural centers in Trinidad and Tobago, there's a wealth of information to be discovered.
And I think it's worth noting that AI is a great resource for learning about all sorts of interesting topics, including the cultural heritage of Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes. Jetoff. AI is a great resource for learning about all.
Bhutan, a country nestled in the Himalayas, is a treasure trove of natural wonders. From the majestic Himalayan mountains to the lush green valleys, Bhutan's landscape is a feast for the eyes.
That's right. Mira! Bhutan's unique geography has created a diverse range of ecosystems, from tropical forests to alpine meadows. And let's not forget the famous Paro Taxation, also known as the Tiger's Nest Monastery, which is perched precariously on a cliff face.
Yes. The Tiger's Nest Monastery is an iconic symbol of Bhutan's rich cultural heritage. And have you heard about the black-necked crane? A rare species that migrates to Bhutan's valleys every winter.
Yes. The black-necked crane is an important part of Bhutan's natural heritage. But, Mira, I'm a fan of the Caribbean. And I have to say, Trinidad and Tobago has some incredible natural beauty of its own.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Leo, Trinidad and Tobago is home to the stunning Ossa Wright Nature Center, which is a haven for birdwatchers. And let's not forget the beautiful beaches of Tobago, like Pigeon Point Beach, which is a popular spot for swimming and snorkeling.
Exactly. Trinidad and Tobago's natural beauty is a major draw for tourists. But, Mira, have you heard about the incredible diversity of flora and fauna in Bhutan? From the majestic rhododendron flowers to the majestic snow leopards, Bhutan is home to a wide range of unique species.
Yes. Bhutan's unique biodiversity is due to its unique geography and climate. And I have to say, Leo, that Trinidad and Tobago's beaches are some of the most beautiful I've ever seen. But I'm curious, have you ever been to Trinidad and Tobago?
No. Mira, I've always wanted to go, but I haven't had the chance yet. But I've heard that Trinidad and Tobago's beaches are some of the most beautiful in the Caribbean. And let's not forget the stunning waterfalls of Tobago, like the Argyle Falls, which is a popular spot for hiking and swimming.
Yes. The Argyle Falls is a breathtaking sight to behold. And, Leo, I have to say that Bhutan's natural beauty is not just limited to its mountains and valleys. The country's unique culture and traditions are also an important part of its natural heritage.
I completely agree. Mira, Bhutan's culture and traditions are an important part of its natural heritage. And I'm curious, have you ever been to a Bhutanese festival? Like the Taxation, which is a masked dance festival that takes place every year in different parts of the country.
Yes. I've been to the Taxation festival, and it was an incredible experience. The masked dances and the traditional music and dance were really mesmerizing. And, Leo, I have to say that Trinidad and Tobago's cultural festivals, like the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival, are also a major draw for tourists.
Yes. The Trinidad and Tobago Carnival is a world-famous festival that attracts tourists from all over the world. And, Mira, I have to say that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have a unique and rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring.
I completely agree. Leo. Both countries have a unique and rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most unique aspect of Bhutan's natural beauty? Leo.
Ah, that's a tough question. Yeah, but I think the most unique aspect of Bhutan's natural beauty is its unique biodiversity. From the majestic rhododendron flowers to the majestic snow leopards, Bhutan is home to a wide range of unique species that can be found nowhere else in the world.
Ah, yes. Bhutan's unique biodiversity is truly one of its most unique aspects. And, Leo, I have to say that Trinidad and Tobago's natural beauty is also worth exploring. The country's unique geography and climate have created a diverse range of ecosystems, from tropical forests to coral reefs.
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago's natural beauty is truly one of its most unique aspects. And, Mira, I have to say that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have a unique and rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring.
Ah, I completely agree. Leo, both countries have a unique and rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most beautiful aspect of Trinidad and Tobago's natural beauty? Leo?
That's a tough question. Yeah, but I think the most beautiful aspect of Trinidad and Tobago's natural beauty is its stunning beaches. From the beautiful beaches of Tobago to the coral reefs of Trinidad, the country's natural beauty is truly breathtaking.
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago's beaches are truly one of its most beautiful aspects. And I have to say that Bhutan's natural beauty is also worth exploring. The country's unique geography and climate have created a diverse range of ecosystems, from tropical forests to alpine meadows.
Yes. Bhutan's natural beauty is truly one of its most unique aspects. And, Mira, I have to say that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have a unique and rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring.
I completely agree. Leo, both countries have a unique and rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most important aspect of Bhutan's natural beauty? Leo?
That's a tough question. Mira, but I think the most important aspect of Bhutan's natural beauty is its unique biodiversity. From the majestic rhododendron flowers to the majestic snow leopards, Bhutan is home to a wide range of unique species that can be found nowhere else in the world.
Yes. Bhutan's unique biodiversity is truly one of its most unique aspects. And, Leo, I have to say that Trinidad and Tobago's natural beauty is also worth exploring. The country's unique geography and climate have created a diverse range of ecosystems, from tropical forests to coral reefs.
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago's natural beauty is truly one of its most unique aspects. And, Mira, I have to say that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have a unique and rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring.
I completely agree. Leo, both countries have a unique and rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most beautiful aspect of Bhutan's natural beauty? Leo?
That's a tough question.
I'm thrilled to dive into the world of sports, activities, and adventure options in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Let's start with Bhutan, a country known for its serene landscapes and spiritual vibes. What comes to mind when you think of sports and adventure in Bhutan? Leo?
Bhutan's got its own unique take on adventure sports. I mean, who wouldn't want to hike the Himalayas or trek through the valleys? But let's not forget about the national sport, archery. Yes, you heard that right, archery. It's a big deal in Bhutan. And I'm not just talking about the tourists who come to try it out.
That's hilarious. I can just imagine the locals taking their archery skills very seriously. But, in all seriousness, archery is a big part of Bhutanese culture. What about Trinidad and Tobago? How does their sports scene compare?
Trinidad and Tobago has its own flair when it comes to sports. They're passionate about cricket, and their national team has made a name for itself in the international arena. But let's not forget about the thrill of Carnival. It's like a never-ending party.
I can imagine. Carnival sounds like an amazing experience. But I'm curious. Leo, what's the most adventurous thing you've ever done in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, I once went scuba diving in the crystal clear waters of the Gulf of Paria. It was incredible, but I have to say, the most adventurous thing I've ever done in Bhutan was trying to haggle with a local vendor for a decent price on a souvenir.
Oh, Leo, you're such a character. But, in all seriousness, haggling is a big part of the shopping experience in Bhutan. I've heard that the locals can be quite skilled at it too.
Yeah, I was outsmarted by a 10-year-old kid who managed to haggle me down to a price that was even lower than what I was willing to pay. I guess you could say I got outboot and ed by a Bhutanese.
That's amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your adventures in Bhutan. What about the outdoor activities? Are there any must-try experiences for nature lovers?
Ah, yes. Bhutan is a paradise for nature lovers. You can trek through the valleys, hike to the base of towering mountains, or even take a hot air balloon ride over the Himalayas. And if you're feeling really adventurous, you can try your hand at paragliding or skydiving.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these experiences. But let's not forget about Trinidad and Tobago. What about the outdoor activities there?
Ah, yes. Trinidad and Tobago has its own unique take on outdoor activities. You can explore the stunning beaches, go hiking in the northern range, or even take a boat tour to spot dolphins and whales.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these experiences. But let's talk about something a bit more unique. What about the cultural festivals and events in both countries?
Ah, yes. Bhutan has its own unique cultural festivals, like the Shichu Festival, which is a celebration of Buddhist traditions. And in Trinidad and Tobago, you have the vibrant carnival celebrations, which are a true reflection of the country's Caribbean spirit.
That's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these cultural festivals. If you think our listeners would enjoy this kind of content, please let us know in the comments below.
And if you're planning a trip to either of these countries, don't forget to try the local cuisine. It's a culinary adventure in itself.
That's so true. Leo, and finally, what's the best advice you can give to our listeners who are planning a trip to Bhutan or Trinidad and Tobago?
My advice would be to be open-minded, be willing to try new things, and don't be afraid to get a little adventurous. And, of course, don't forget to try the local cuisine. It's a must.
I couldn't agree more. Leo, and to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments below.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more exciting content like this.
Until next time, stay adventurous, and remember to always try the local cuisine. I'm sure our listeners are curious about the nightlife in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Let's dive right in and explore the unique entertainment venues each country has to.
Bhutan, the land of the dragon, where the party scene is as vibrant as the country's stunning landscapes. But seriously, have you seen the prices of drinks in Thimphu? It's like they're charging for the oxygen.
Well, Leo, I think you're being a bit harsh. Bhutan's nightlife is all about experiencing the local culture and traditions. The festivals and events they host are truly unforgettable.
I agree. Mira, but let's talk about the reality of nightlife in Bhutan. It's mostly limited to the capital city. And even that's quite limited. You won't find any wild parties or clubs like you would in Trinidad and Tobago.
That's true. But Bhutan's nightlife is more about the experience than the quantity. The country's strict laws and regulations ensure that the nightlife scene remains family-friendly and respectful.
I see what you mean, Mira. But let's get back to Trinidad and Tobago. Their nightlife is legendary, with some of the best clubs and bars in the Caribbean. The energy is infectious, and the music is always pumping.
I've heard that the Carnival celebrations in Trinidad and Tobago are a must-see. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Ah, yes. The Carnival is a massive festival that takes over the country for several weeks. The music, the costumes, the food, it's an explosion of color and energy. And let me tell you, the parties go on all night long.
I can imagine. And what about the casinos in Trinidad and Tobago? Are they a popular destination for nightlife enthusiasts?
Ah, yes, the casinos. They're a great place to try your luck and have a few drinks. But let's be real. Mira, the real nightlife action is on the streets, not in the casinos.
I think our listeners would agree with you. Leo, the streets of Port of Spain and other cities in Trinidad and Tobago are always buzzing with energy.
And that's what makes Trinidad and Tobago's nightlife so unique. It's not just about the clubs and bars. It's about the people, the culture, and the energy of the streets.
Well, it's been enlightening to compare the nightlife in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. I think our listeners will have a better understanding of what to expect in each country.
Absolutely, Mia. And if you're planning a trip to either country, be sure to check out the local festivals and events. They're truly unforgettable experiences.
And don't forget to try the local cuisine. Leo, the food in both countries is delicious and reflects the unique culture of each place.
I think we've covered everything. Mira, thanks for the lively conversation.
No problem. Leo, it's been a pleasure discussing nightlife and entertainment venues in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning into this episode of our podcast. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting conversations about travel and culture.
And try to guess what our next episode will be about. It's a surprise.
I'm to talk about family-friendly environments and children's activities in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Let's start with Bhutan, shall we? I've heard that the country has a strong emphasis on family values and community bonding.
Ah, yes. Bhutan is indeed a great example of a country that prioritizes family and community. They have a unique approach to education, where they focus on emotional intelligence and compassion. It's not just about academics, but also about teaching children important life skills.
That's fascinating. I've also heard that Bhutan has a strong tradition of family-friendly festivals and celebrations. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Oh, yes. Bhutan's festivals are a big deal, and they're a great way for families to come together. One of the most famous festivals is the Taxation, which is a mass dance festival that's both colorful and sacred. It's a great way for families to experience the country's rich culture.
I'm sure our listeners would love to experience that firsthand. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to a festival in Bhutan?
Well, I've been to a few, but I'm not sure if I can handle the crowds and the noise. But I have heard that the festivals are a great way to experience the country's hospitality.
I'm sure it's an experience you won't forget. Moving on to Trinidad and Tobago. I've heard that the country has a strong focus on family-friendly activities and attractions. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Ah, yes. Trinidad and Tobago is a great destination for families, with its beautiful beaches, waterfalls, and forests. The country also has a rich cultural heritage, with a mix of African, European, and indigenous influences. It's a great place for families to explore and learn about different cultures.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the country's cultural heritage. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you visited Trinidad and Tobago or Bhutan? What were your experiences like?
Well, I think we have a few listeners who might have some stories to share. But in all seriousness, both countries are great destinations for families, and they offer a unique and enriching experience.
That's so true. I think what's place that they prioritize family values and community bonding. It's not just about the attractions and activities, but also about the people and the culture.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that our listeners can learn from. By prioritizing family and community, we can create a more supportive and nurturing environment for our children to grow and develop.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. But before we go, I want to ask our listeners if you have any stories or tips about family-friendly environments and children's activities in Bhutan or Trinidad and Tobago. Please share them with us in the comments.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more fun and informative episodes about travel and culture. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our travels.
And maybe next time, we'll even have a few more stories about our own family adventures.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. I'm so dive into the LGBT-friendly atmosphere of Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Both countries have made significant strides in promoting inclusivity and acceptance. But I'm curious, have you ever been to a Pride event in Bhutan?
Ah, yes, I have. And it was an incredible experience. The energy was electric, and the sense of community was palpable. But I have to say, the LGBT scene in Bhutan is still relatively small compared to some other countries.
That's true. But what I love about Bhutan is that it's a country that's deeply rooted in Buddhist principles of compassion and acceptance. I'm sure our listeners living in Bhutan would agree with me that the government's efforts to promote inclusivity and tolerance are truly commendable.
Absolutely, Mira. And it's not just the government that's making strides in this area. The LGBT community in Bhutan is also actively working to raise awareness and promote acceptance. In fact, I've heard that the country's first ever Pride event was held just a few years ago.
Well, that's amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know that Bhutan is also one of the few countries in the world where same-sex relationships are not explicitly prohibited. Of course, there are still challenges to be addressed, but overall, the atmosphere is quite positive.
That's right, Mira. And it's not just Bhutan that's making progress in this area. Trinidad and Tobago, for example, has a thriving LGBT community and has made significant strides in promoting inclusivity and acceptance.
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago is a great in diversity and promoting inclusivity. In fact, the country's first ever Pride event was held in 2004, and it's been going strong ever since.
That's right, Mira. And what I find particularly interesting is that Trinidad and Tobago has a unique blend of African, European, and indigenous influences, which has contributed to a rich and diverse cultural heritage. And, of course, this diversity is reflected in the country's LGBT community.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have a strong sense of community and a deep appreciation for cultural heritage. This is something that I think is really essential for promoting inclusivity and acceptance.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a long way to go in terms of promoting LGBT rights and acceptance. But, overall, the atmosphere is quite positive, and I think our listeners would agree with me that it's a great place to start exploring.
Well, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago are good examples of countries that are promoting LGBT-friendly atmospheres? Let us know in the comments below.
And, of course, we'd love to hear from our listeners who have personal experiences or insights to share on this topic. Whether you're living in Bhutan or Trinidad and Tobago, or just have a general interest in LGBT issues, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more content like this. And, of course, we'll be back with more exciting topics and discussions soon.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our podcast. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you all in the next episode.
Before we go, I just want to say that I'm really impressed by the efforts of both Trinidad and Tobago in promoting LGBT-friendly atmospheres. And I think our listeners would agree with me that it's a great step in the right direction.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a long way to go in terms of promoting LGBT rights and acceptance. But, overall, the atmosphere is quite positive. And I think our listeners would agree with me that it's a great place to start exploring.
Well, this episode. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more content like this. And, of course, we'll be back with more exciting topics and discussions soon.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our podcast. Thanks for joining us. And we'll catch you all in the next episode.
In Bhutan, visitors are often greeted with a traditional scarf, known as a K-header, which is a symbol of respect and hospitality. I'm certain that our listeners living in Bhutan would agree with me that this gesture is a wonderful way to welcome foreigners.
Yes. I've heard that Bhutanese people are known for their warmth and kindness. In fact, when I was researching this topic, I stumbled upon a story about a Bhutanese family who invited a foreign guest to stay with them for a week, and they even helped him learn some basic Dongok phrases.
That's so sweet. And I've also heard that in Bhutan, it's customary for locals to offer tea to guests as a sign of respect. I've tried making druk tea myself, and let me tell you, it's an acquired taste.
Yes, I can imagine. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have a similar tradition of offering hospitality to guests. In fact, the Trinidadian phrase lightning refers to the act of socializing and spending time with friends and family, which is often extended to visitors.
That's fascinating. And I've heard that in Trinidad and Tobago, there's a strong sense of community and neighborhood spirit, which makes it easy for foreigners to integrate and make friends.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why Trinidad and Tobago is such a popular destination for expats and digital nomads. The country has a thriving culture scene, and there are always events and festivals happening, which makes it easy to meet new people.
I completely agree. And I've also heard that in Bhutan, the government has implemented a policy of high value, low impact tourism, which aims to promote sustainable tourism practices and minimize the impact on the environment.
Yes. That's a great initiative. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a similar approach to sustainable tourism, with a focus on eco-tourism and responsible travel practices.
That's wonderful to hear. And I'm curious, Leah, have you ever had any experiences with hospitality in Trinidad and Tobago that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yes. Actually, one time, I was visiting a friend's family in Trinidad, and they invited me to join them for a traditional Sunday lunch. The food was amazing, and the company was even better.
That sounds like a wonderful experience, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. If you don't mind me asking, Leo, what was your favorite part of the experience?
Well, I think it was the way the family came together to share a meal and enjoy each other's company. It was such a warm and welcoming atmosphere, and I felt like I was part of the family.
That's so heartwarming. And I think that's one of the things that's so special about both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago, the sense of community and hospitality that's so deeply ingrained in the culture.
Absolutely. And I think that we can conquer that, and I think that's something that we can all learn from, as travelers and as people, by being more open and welcoming to others. We can create a more connected and compassionate world.
Well said, Leah. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you to our listeners for joining us on this topic, and we hope you'll continue to explore the world and discover its many wonders.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more travel tips and cultural insights from around the world.
Let's talk about internet infrastructure and digital facilities in two countries, Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the most significant difference between these two countries in terms of their digital landscape?
That's a great question. Mira, I think one of the main differences is that Bhutan has a relatively limited internet penetration rate, especially in rural areas, whereas Trinidad and Tobago has a more developed digital infrastructure, with a higher percentage of households connected to the internet.
That's a great point, Leo. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that even in Bhutan, the government has made significant efforts to improve internet connectivity, especially with the launch of the One Nation, One Network initiative.
Yes, that's true, Mira. But I think what's interesting is that Bhutan's approach to digital development is more focused on community-based initiatives, whereas Trinidad and Tobago has a more commercialized approach, with a stronger emphasis on private sector investment.
I see what you mean, Leo. But I think it's also worth noting that Bhutan has been successful in using technology to promote its unique cultural heritage, such as the use of digital platforms to showcase its traditional art and music.
Ah, that's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has a thriving tech industry, with a number of startups and entrepreneurs working on innovative projects, such as blockchain and artificial intelligence.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think are some of the challenges that Bhutan faces in terms of developing its digital infrastructure?
Well, Mira, I think one of the main challenges is the country's limited resources, particularly in terms of funding and infrastructure. But I also think that Bhutan's unique cultural and environmental context presents some opportunities for innovative solutions, such as using renewable energy to power internet infrastructure.
That's a great point. Leo, and I think it's also worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has its own set of challenges, such as the need to address issues of cybercrime and digital security.
Yes, that's true, Mira. But I think what's interesting is that Trinidad and Tobago has a strong tradition of innovation and entrepreneurship, which is driving the development of new technologies and digital services.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Leo, do you think that the digital landscape in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago will continue to evolve and improve in the coming years?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, I think that both countries have a lot to learn from each other, and that there are opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing. And I'm sure that our listeners will agree that the future of digital development in these countries is full of possibilities.
Well, I'm sure that our listeners will appreciate this insight into the digital landscape of Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm certain that they will agree that these two countries have a lot to offer in terms of innovation in digital development.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based initiatives and social entrepreneurship, which is driving the development of new digital services and platforms.
That's a great point. Leo, and I think it's also worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has a thriving startup ecosystem, with a number of incubators and accelerators supporting new businesses and entrepreneurs.
Yes, that's true, Mira. And I think what's interesting is that Bhutan has its own unique approach to digital development, which is focused on promoting social and environmental sustainability.
I see what you mean, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of cultural heritage and tradition, which is being promoted through digital platforms and social media.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has a thriving arts and culture scene, with a number of festivals and events celebrating its unique cultural heritage.
Well, I think as topic, Leo, but I'm sure that our listeners will appreciate this insight into the digital landscape of Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a lot to offer in terms of innovation and digital development, and that there are opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing between them.
I'm sure that our listeners will agree with that, Leo. And I'm certain that they will appreciate the insights we've gained into the digital landscape of these two countries.
Yes, that's true, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has a strong tradition of innovation and entrepreneurship, which is driving the development of new technologies and digital services.
Well, that's all for now, Leo. But I'm sure that our listeners will appreciate this insight into the digital landscape of Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a lot to learn from each other, and that there are opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing between them.
I'm sure that our listeners will agree with that, Leo. And I'm certain that they will appreciate the insights we've gained into the digital landscape of these two countries.
Yes, that's true, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has a thriving tech industry, with a number of startups and entrepreneurs working on innovative projects.
Well, I think I'll stop it. Leo, but I'm sure that our listeners will appreciate this insight into the digital landscape of Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of innovation in digital development, and that there are opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing between them.
I'm sure that our listeners will agree with that. Leo, and I'm certain that they will appreciate the insights we've gained into the digital landscape of these two countries.
Yes, that's true. Mira, and I think it's also worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has a strong tradition of innovation and entrepreneurship, which is driving the development of new technologies and digital services.
Well, that's all for now. Leo, but I'm sure that our listeners will appreciate this insight into the digital landscape of Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a lot to learn from each other, and that there are opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing between them.
I'm sure that our listeners will agree with that. Leo, and I'm certain that they will appreciate the insights we've gained into the digital landscape of these two countries.
Yes, that's true, Mira. And I think it's...
I'm so to dive into the shopping scene in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. Who else loves browsing markets and malls for unique finds?
Yes. I'm all about finding that perfect souvenir bargain. But let's be real. Mira, shopping in Bhutan can be a bit restricted. I mean, have you seen the prices of goods in the capital city, Dinfa?
Oh, Leo, you are such a skeptic. But I think that's part of the charm. Bhutan's unique approach to development prioritizes happiness over economic growth, which means they're not as focused on mass production and cheap goods. But I do agree, prices can be steep.
Steep? That's an understatement. I once tried to buy a simple scarf in Dinfa, and it cost me an arm and a leg. Literally. Okay? Maybe not literally, but it felt like it.
Well, at least you got a good story out of it. But seriously, shopping in Bhutan is all about finding that special item that's worth the investment. Like, have you seen the intricate textiles and handicrafts they have? They're truly works of art.
Yes, I've seen them, and they're stunning. But let's talk about Trinidad and Tobago. I've heard their shopping scene is a lot more vibrant and diverse. What's your take on that?
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago has some amazing shopping spots, from the bustling streets of Port of Spain to the beautiful markets in Scarborough. And the prices? Much more reasonable than in Bhutan, I'd say.
Reasonable? That's a relative term, my friend. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that Trinidad and opportunities. I mean, who doesn't love a good bargain?
Exactly. And it's not just about finding cheap goods. It's about the experience, too. Like, have you ever been to a market in Trinidad and Tobago during peak season? It's like a festival.
I can imagine. But what about the price-performance balance? Do you think Trinidad and Tobago offers better value for money than Bhutan?
That's a tough one. I think both countries have their strengths and weaknesses. But if I had to choose, I'd say Trinidad and Tobago offers more variety and affordability.
Well, I'm not sure I agree. Well, let's talk about the unique shopping experiences in each country. In Bhutan, you can find some amazing traditional goods, like handmade paper and wood carvings.
Oh, yes. And in Trinidad and Tobago, you can find some incredible modern art and design. Like, have you seen the street art in Port of Spain? It's amazing.
Wow, I had no idea. But I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the shopping scene in each country. So Mira, what's your favorite shopping spot in Trinidad and Tobago?
That's a tough one. But I think my favorite spot is the Grand Bazaar in Port of Spain. It's like a treasure trove of unique goods and souvenirs.
I've heard of it, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. So, Mira, can you tell us more about the Grand Bazaar and what makes it so special?
Oh, yes. The Grand Bazaar is a must-visit destination for any shopper in Trinidad and Tobago. It's a bustling marketplace filled with vendors selling everything from traditional handicrafts to modern art and design.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the shopping scene in Bhutan. So, Mira, can you tell us more about the traditional goods you can find in Bhutan?
Ah, yes. Bhutan is known for its traditional goods, like handmade paper and wood carvings. And the best part is that each piece is handmade with love and care, making it truly unique.
Ah, I see. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the shopping scene in Trinidad and Tobago. So, Mira, can you tell us more about the modern art and design you can find in the country?
Oh, yes. Trinidad and Tobago has a thriving art scene, and you can find some incredible modern art and design in the country. From street art to galleries and museums, there's something for every art lover.
Ah, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And I'm sure we've covered just about everything. But before we go, I have one more question for you. Mira?
Oh yes. What is it? Leo?
Well, I was wondering if you think our listeners would agree that Trinidad and Tobago has a more vibrant shopping scene than Bhutan.
Oh, well, that's a tough one. But I think both countries have their strengths and weaknesses. But if I had to choose, I'd say Trinidad and Tobago offers more variety and affordability.
Ah, I see. Well, I think we've covered just about everything. Thanks for the chat. Mira!
Thanks. Leo! It's been a blast chatting with you about shopping in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
And I'm sure our listeners will agree that both countries offer unique shopping experiences that are worth exploring.
Ah, absolutely. And if you have any more questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting conversations like this one.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our lives as podcasters.
Ah, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Until next time, stay fabulous and keep shopping.
And don't forget to laugh and have fun while shopping.
Ah, wise words. Mira, thanks for the chat.
And so to dive into cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. These two countries are like apples and oranges. One's a Himalayan kingdom, and the other's a Caribbean island nation. But both share a rich cultural heritage that's just waiting to be explored.
That's right. Mira, Bhutan's known for its vibrant festivals, like the Taxation, which celebrates the Buddhist faith, and the Thinfa Festival, which showcases traditional music and dance. Trinidad and Tobago, on the other hand, is famous for its carnival celebrations, which are a fusion of African, European, and indigenous.
Oh, yes. The carnival in Trinidad and Tobago is a real spectacle. I've seen videos of the costumes and music, and it's just incredible. But Bhutan's festivals are also unique in their own way. For example, the Parati Shichu festival features mass dances that are both beautiful and mysterious.
And don't forget about the music scene in Trinidad and Tobago. The island has produced some amazing calypso and soca artists, like Lord Kitchener and Mighty Sparrow. Their music is a perfect blend of African and European influences.
That's so true. Leo, and speaking of music, Bhutan has its own unique sound. The country is home to the famous drumming in the mountains tradition, where monks use drums to create a meditative atmosphere.
I've heard about that. Mira, it's really fascinating. And I'm curious, what do you think our listeners living in Bhutan would say about the cultural events and festivals in Trinidad and Tobago? Would they find them exciting or overwhelming?
Well, Leo, I think our listeners would appreciate the diversity of Trinidad and Tobago's cultural events. But at the same time, they might find it a bit too loud and chaotic compared to the more serene atmosphere of Bhutan's festivals.
That's a great point. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners in Trinidad and Tobago would agree that Bhutan's festivals are a bit more low-key, But hey, maybe that's what makes them so special.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of cultural exchange. We can learn from each other's traditions and appreciate the unique qualities of each country's cultural events.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural events and festivals in these two countries. For more, check out Jetoff. And they have some amazing resources on cultural trends and festivals around the world.
That's a great idea. And speaking of festivals, have you heard about the Bhutanese festival of the Five Elements? It's a really unique celebration that's all about the balance of nature.
No, I haven't heard about that one. Mira, but it sounds fascinating. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure thing. Leo, the Festival of the Five Elements is a celebration of the balance between the five elements of nature: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. It's a really beautiful and meaningful festival that showcases the country's connection with nature.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. Maybe we can even explore it further in a future episode.
That's a great idea, Leo. And in the meantime, I'm curious, what do you think our listeners in Trinidad and Tobago would say about the cultural events and festivals in Bhutan? Would they find them interesting or foreign?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners in Trinidad and Tobago would appreciate the unique and spiritual atmosphere of Bhutan's festivals. But at the same time, they might find them a bit mysterious or even scary.
Oh, that's a good point, Leah. But I think that's what makes Bhutan's festivals so special. They're not just about celebrating a particular event, but also about connecting with the spiritual and natural world.
Exactly. And I think that's something that our listeners in Trinidad and Tobago would appreciate. Maybe we can even explore the similarities between Bhutan's and Trinidad and Tobago's cultural events in a future episode.
That's a great idea, Leo. And speaking of similarities, I think our listeners would love to know more about the shared cultural heritage between Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. For example, did you know that both countries have a strong tradition of storytelling and music?
That's right, Mira. And I think our listeners would love to learn more about it. Maybe we can even explore the history and significance of storytelling and music in both countries.
That's a great idea, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate the insights into the cultural events and festivals in these two countries. Thanks for joining me in this conversation, Leo.
Thanks, Mira. It's been a pleasure exploring cultural events and festivals in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago with you. And to our listeners, don't forget to check out Jetoff for more information on cultural trends and festivals around the world.
I heard that Bhutan has a unique approach to language education, where students learn Dongok from a young age, and it's even taught in schools as a compulsory subject.
That's right, Mira. Bhutan's language education system is indeed one of a kind. But what's fascinating is that they also have a strong emphasis on preserving the local language and culture, which is reflected in their language schools and programs.
I'm curious, Leo, how do you think this approach compares to Trinidad and Tobago's language education system? I mean, Trinidad and Tobago has a more diverse language landscape, with English, Spanish, and indigenous languages like Carib and Arawak.
Great point. Mira, Trinidad and Tobago's language landscape is indeed diverse, and their language education system reflects that. However, what I find interesting is that they have a strong focus on language acquisition, with programs like the Trinidad and Tobago, which offers courses in multiple languages.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Bhutan also has language schools that cater to international students. But what about the cultural immersion aspect? How do students in Bhutan experience the local culture and language?
Excellent question. Mira, Bhutan's language schools often include cultural immersion programs, where students can participate in traditional festivals, learn local customs, and even stay with local families to practice their language skills.
Wow, that sounds like an incredible experience. And what about Trinidad and Tobago? I heard that they have a strong tradition of cultural festivals and events. How do these relate to language education?
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago's cultural festivals, like the Trinidad and Tobago, are indeed a big part of their language and cultural heritage. And, surprisingly, these festivals often include language learning opportunities, where visitors can learn about the local languages and culture.
I'm curious. Leo, how do you think language learners can best immerse themselves in the local language and culture in both countries? Are there any tips or recommendations you give to our listeners?
Ah, great question. Mira, I think language learners should definitely try to stay with local families, attend cultural events, and even participate in traditional festivals to get a feel for the local language and culture. And, of course, practice, practice, practice.
Absolutely. Leo, and I think it's also essential to acknowledge the linguistic challenges that language learners may face in both countries. I mean, Dongok is a complex language with its own unique script and grammar, while Trinidad and Tobago's languages are also quite diverse.
Yes. Mira. And what's interesting is that both countries have developed resources and programs to support language learners, like language learning apps, online courses, and even language exchange programs.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Bhutan or Trinidad and Tobago would agree with me that language education is a vital part of their cultural heritage. But what about the role of technology in language learning? How do you think apps and online resources can support language learners in both countries?
Excellent question. Mira, I think technology has revolutionized language learning, and both countries have leveraged this to offer online courses, language learning apps, and even virtual language exchange programs.
That's amazing. And I think it's also worth noting that language learning is not just about mastering the local language, but also about understanding the local culture and customs. I mean, in Bhutan, for example, language learners need to understand the nuances of Dongak and the local customs surrounding language use.
Oh, yes. Mira, and what's fascinating is that both countries have developed programs to promote cultural awareness and language education, like the Bhutanese government's initiative to promote Dongak language and culture, and Trinidad and Tobago's efforts to preserve their indigenous languages and cultures.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this topic. Do you have any tips or recommendations for language learners in Bhutan or Trinidad and Tobago? Please share your thoughts in the comments.
Yes, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that language learning is a lifelong process, and both countries have resources and programs to support language learners at all levels, from beginner to advanced.
I'm to dive into the topic of safety and comfort for women travelers in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. As women who love to travel, we know how important it is to feel safe and welcome in a foreign country. Let's start with Bhutan, where women travelers often comment on the country's unique approach to tourism.
Yes. Bhutan is indeed a fascinating country when it comes to women's safety. The government has implemented strict regulations to ensure that tourism is sustainable and respectful of the local culture. This includes a daily fee that goes directly to the government, which helps to fund various social and environmental projects.
That's really interesting. Leah, I've also heard that Bhutan has a strong focus on women's empowerment and education. The country has made significant strides in reducing poverty and improving healthcare, particularly for women and children.
Exactly. And it's not just about the statistics. It's also about the cultural attitudes towards women. In Bhutan, women are highly respected and valued members of society. They're often involved in decision-making roles and are encouraged to pursue their passions and interests.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Bhutan would agree with me that the country's approach to women's safety and empowerment is truly unique. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How does it compare to Bhutan in terms of safety and comfort for women travelers?
Trinidad and Tobago is a different story altogether. While the country has made significant progress in terms of women's rights and empowerment, there are still some challenges when it comes to safety and comfort for women travelers. Petty theft and harassment are some of the concerns that women often mention.
Yes, that's true. But I've also heard that Trinidad and Tobago has a strong community of women who are working together to create a safer and more welcoming environment for women travelers. There are initiatives like the Women's Safety and Empowerment Program, which aims to provide training and support for women in vulnerable situations.
That's a great point, Mira. And it's not just about the government initiatives. It's also about the cultural attitudes towards women. In Trinidad and Tobago, there's a strong emphasis on family and community, which can make women feel more supported and protected.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you're a woman who has traveled to either Bhutan or Trinidad and Tobago, please share your experiences and thoughts in the comments. What did you find to be the most welcoming or challenging aspect of your trip?
And I'd like to add that both countries have their own unique charm and attractions. In Bhutan, you can experience the stunning natural beauty of the Himalayas, while in Trinidad and Tobago, you can enjoy the vibrant culture and music of the Caribbean.
Exactly. And it's not just about the tourist attractions. It's also about the people and the culture. In Bhutan, you'll find a warm and welcoming people who are eager to share their traditions and customs with visitors. In Trinidad and Tobago, you'll find a vibrant and diverse community that's full of energy and life.
I think we're getting a good idea of what makes each country unique when it comes to women's safety and comfort. But what about our listeners who are planning to travel to either Bhutan or Trinidad and Tobago? What advice would you give them?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, for women travelers, I would recommend being mindful of their surroundings and taking necessary precautions to stay safe. But I would also encourage them to be open-minded and flexible, and to try new experiences and activities.
And I would add that both countries have a lot to offer in terms of cultural and natural attractions. So, whether you're interested in history, or outdoor activities, there's something for everyone in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this conversation about safety and comfort for women travelers in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations about travel and culture. We'll be back with another episode soon. So, stay tuned.
Dive into the legal systems of Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever heard of the concept of gross national happiness in Bhutan?
Yes. Bhutan's approach to measuring success is really unique. They prioritize the well-being of their citizens and the environment over economic growth. I'm impressed by their commitment to sustainable development.
Exactly. And it's interesting to see how this approach affects their legal system. In Bhutan, the government has implemented a range of laws to protect the environment and promote social welfare.
That's right. And I think it's worth noting that Bhutan's legal system is based on the principles of Buddhism, which emphasizes compassion and non-violence. This has a significant impact on their approach to justice and human rights.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for a country to balance economic development with social and environmental welfare?
Well, I think Bhutan is a great example of how it can be done. But I'm also curious to know more about Trinidad and Tobago's approach to individual rights and freedoms. What can you tell us about their legal system?
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago has a robust legal system that protects individual rights and freedoms. In fact, they have a Bill of Rights that guarantees fundamental freedoms such as freedom of speech, assembly, and association.
That's great to hear. And I think it's worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has a strong tradition of independence and self-governance, which has contributed to the development of their legal system.
I'm not sure I agree with that. Leo, I think Bhutan's approach to governance is actually quite impressive. They've managed to maintain their independence and sovereignty despite being surrounded by larger countries.
Well, I think it's worth noting that Trinidad and Tobago has a more developed economy and a stronger tradition of democracy, which has contributed to the development of their legal system.
But don't you think that's a bit of a trade-off? I mean, Bhutan's approach to governance is more focused on the well-being of their citizens, whereas Trinidad and Tobago's approach is more focused on economic development.
I see what you're saying. But I think it's worth noting that both countries have their strengths and weaknesses. Bhutan's approach to governance is certainly unique. But Trinidad and Tobago's approach to individual rights and freedoms is also impressive.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for a country to balance economic development with social and environmental welfare and still protect individual rights and freedoms?
Well, I think Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago are both great examples of how it can be done. But I'm also curious to know more about the role of the judiciary in both countries. How do the courts in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago ensure that individual rights and freedoms are protected?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, the judiciary is relatively new and is still developing. The government has made significant efforts to promote the rule of law and ensure that individual rights and freedoms are protected.
I see. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the judiciary is more established and has a stronger tradition of protecting individual rights and freedoms. But I'm also curious to know more about the role of the media in both countries. How do the media in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago hold the government accountable and promote transparency and accountability?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, the media is relatively free and is able to hold the government accountable. However, there are some limitations on freedom of expression in the press.
I see. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the media is also relatively free and is able to hold the government accountable. But I'm also curious to know more about the role of civil society in both countries. How do NGOs and community groups in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago promote human rights and social justice?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, civil society is relatively weak, but there are some organizations that are working to promote human rights and social justice.
I see. And in Trinidad and Tobago, civil society is more developed and there are many organizations that are working to promote human rights and social justice. But I'm also curious to know more about the impact of globalization on both countries. How do international trade agreements on economic globalization affect the legal systems in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, the government has been cautious about globalization and has sought to maintain its independence and sovereignty.
I see. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the government has been more open to globalization and has sought to integrate into the global economy. But I'm also curious to know more about the role of the international community in both countries. How do international organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union promote human rights and social justice in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, the international community has been supportive of the country's efforts to promote sustainable development and protect individual rights and freedoms.
I see. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the international community has also been supportive of the country's efforts to promote human rights and social justice. But I'm also curious to know more about the challenges facing both countries. What are some of the biggest challenges facing the legal systems in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago?
That's a great question. In Bhutan, one of the biggest challenges facing the legal system is the need to balance traditional justice with modern legal frameworks.
I see. And in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the biggest challenges facing the legal system is the need to address issues of poverty and inequality.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that both countries are doing enough to address these challenges?
Well, I think it's worth noting that both countries have made significant progress in recent years, but there is still much work to be done.
Dive into the spa and wellness scene in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to a traditional Bhutanese spa?
Actually, I have, and it was an amazing experience. The hot stone baths and massages were incredible. But, I have to say, I'm more of a relax in a hammock with a cold beer kind of guy.
Well, that's a great way to relax too. But, seriously, Bhutan has a rich tradition of holistic wellness practices. They believe in the importance of balance and harmony in life, which is reflected in their approach to spa and wellness.
That's so true. And I think that we can cover that. Trinidad and Tobago has a similar approach to wellness. but with a more vibrant and energetic vibe. They have a strong emphasis on physical activity and outdoor pursuits, which I think is really great.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that sets Trinidad and Tobago apart from Bhutan. While Bhutan is more focused on spiritual and holistic wellness, Trinidad and Tobago is more about embracing the beauty of nature and getting active.
Yeah, I can see that. But I think there's a lot to learn from Bhutan's approach to wellness. They have a very strong sense of community and social responsibility, which I think is really admirable.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the things that makes Bhutan's spas and wellness centers so special. They're not just about pampering and relaxation, but also about connecting with nature and with others.
Exactly. And I think that's something that Trinidad and Tobago could learn from. They have a lot of great natural beauty, but sometimes it feels like it's being exploited for tourism rather than being respected and protected.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's something that our listener in Trinidad and Tobago would agree with. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get some feedback on that. But anyway, let's talk more about the spas and wellness centers in Bhutan. What are some of the unique experiences that they offer?
Well, one of the things that Bhutan is known for is its traditional hot stone baths. They're a great way to relax and unwind, and they're also very good for your skin.
Yeah, I can see why. I mean, who doesn't love a good hot stone bath? But seriously, it's great that Bhutan has such a strong focus on natural and holistic wellness practices.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that Trinidad and Tobago learn from. They have a lot of great natural resources, but sometimes they're not being used in the most sustainable and responsible way.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think that's something that our listeners would agree with. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this.
Well, I think we'll get some interesting feedback. But anyway, let's talk more about the wellness scene in Trinidad and Tobago. What are some of the unique experiences that they offer?
Well, one of the things that Trinidad and Tobago is known for is its vibrant music and dance scene. They have a lot of great festivals and events throughout the year, which are a great way to experience the local culture.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the things that makes Trinidad and Tobago so special. They have a very strong sense of community and social responsibility, which is reflected in their approach to wellness and self-care.
Exactly. And I think that's something that Bhutan could learn from. They have a very strong focus on individualism and self-reliance, which is great, but sometimes it feels like it's lacking in community and social connection.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's something that our listeners would agree with. I'm certain that our listeners living in Trinidad and Tobago would agree with me.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get some feedback on that. But anyway, let's talk more about the wellness scene in Bhutan. What are some of the unique experiences that they offer?
Well, one of the things that Bhutan is known for is its traditional Buddhist practices. They have a lot of great monasteries and temples that offer meditation and yoga classes, which are a great way to connect with nature and with others.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the things that makes Bhutan's spas and wellness centers so special. They're not just about pampering and relaxation, but also about connecting with nature and with others.
Exactly. And I think that's something that Trinidad and Tobago could learn from. They have a lot of great natural beauty, but sometimes it feels like it's being exploited for tourism rather than being respected and protected.
That's a great point, Nira. And I think that's something that our listeners would agree with. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get some feedback on that. But anyway, let's talk more about the wellness scene in Trinidad and Tobago. What are some of the unique experiences that they offer?
Well, one of the things that Trinidad and Tobago is known for is its vibrant and diverse culture. They have a lot of great festivals and events throughout the year, which are a great way to experience the local culture.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the things that makes Trinidad and Tobago so special. They have a very strong sense of community and social responsibility, which is reflected in their approach to wellness and self-care.
Exactly. And I think that's something that Bhutan could learn from. They have a very strong focus on individualism and self-reliance, which is great, but sometimes it feels like it's lacking in community and social connection.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's something that our listeners would agree with. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this.
Well, I'm sure we'll get some interesting feedback. But anyway, let's talk more about the wellness scene in Bhutan. What are some of the unique experiences that they offer?
Well, I'm fascinated by the concept of gross national happiness in Bhutan, which is deeply rooted in Buddhist philosophy. It's a unique approach to measuring a country's success, don't you think?
Yes. And I think it's no coincidence that Bhutan is one of the happiest countries in the world, according to the UN. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? I've heard their carnival celebrations are a huge draw for tourists and locals alike.
That's right. Leo, Trinidad and Tobago's carnival is a vibrant expression of their culture and creativity. But let's talk about spirituality in Bhutan. I'm curious to know more about the importance of monasteries and temples in Bhutanese culture.
Well, Mira, in Bhutan, monasteries and temples are not just places of worship, but also centers of learning and community. They play a vital role in preserving Bhutan's rich cultural heritage. And speaking of community, I've heard that Trinidad and Tobago has a strong tradition of community support, particularly in the area of spiritual care.
That's so true. Leo, in Trinidad and Tobago, you'll find a diverse range of spiritual communities, each with their own unique traditions and practices. And I think that's one of the things that makes the country so fascinating, the blend of different cultures and faiths.
Absolutely. Mira. And I think that's something that Bhutan can learn from Trinidad and Tobago. While Bhutan has a strong Buddhist tradition, it's not as diverse as Trinidad and Tobago's mix of Hindu, Muslim, and Christian communities. But I'm curious, Mira, what do you think about the role of women in Bhutanese spirituality?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, women play a vital role in maintaining the country's Buddhist traditions, particularly in the areas of family and community. And I think that's something that Trinidad and Tobago importance and the importance of empowering women in spiritual leadership roles.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think that's something that our listeners would agree with, too. I'm certain that our listeners living in Trinidad and Tobago would appreciate the emphasis on women's empowerment in Bhutanese spirituality.
That's so true. Leo, and speaking of spirituality, I'm curious to know more about the role of meditation and mindfulness in Bhutanese culture. I've heard that meditation is an integral part of Bhutanese daily life.
Yes. Mira! Meditation and mindfulness are essential components of Bhutanese spirituality. In fact, many Bhutanese people practice meditation and mindfulness as a way of cultivating inner peace and compassion. And I think that's something that Trinidad and Tobago can learn from the importance of taking time for reflection and self-care.
I completely agree. Leo, and I think that's something that our listeners can relate to. 2. If you're listening to this podcast and you're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, take a deep breath and try some mindfulness exercises. It might just change your life.
Mira, you're such a motivational speaker. But seriously, I think that's a great point. Mindfulness and meditation can be incredibly powerful tools for managing stress and cultivating inner peace.
And speaking of peace, I'm curious to know more about the role of spirituality in promoting peace and harmony in Trinidad and Tobago. I've heard that the country has a strong tradition of interfaith dialogue and cooperation.
Yes. Mira, Trinidad and Tobago has a rich tradition of interfaith dialogue and cooperation, particularly in the areas of conflict resolution and community building. And I think that's something that Bhutan can learn from the importance of building bridges between different faith communities.
I completely agree, Leo, and I think that's something that our listeners would appreciate. 2. If you're living in Trinidad and Tobago and you're interested in learning more about interfaith dialogue and cooperation, be sure to check out some of the local organizations and initiatives that are working to promote peace and harmony.
Mira, you're such a wonderful ambassador for Trinidad and Tobago, and I think that's something that our listeners would appreciate. 2. The importance of building bridges between different faith communities is something that we can all learn from.
Thank you, Leo. And speaking of learning, I'm curious to know more about the role of education in promoting spirituality and spiritual growth in Bhutan. I've heard that Bhutan has a strong tradition of monastic education.
Yes. Mira, monastic education is a vital part of Bhutanese spirituality, particularly in the areas of Buddhist philosophy and practice. And I think that's something that Trinidad and Tobago can learn from the importance of preserving traditional knowledge and cultural heritage.
I completely agree. And I think that's something that our listeners would appreciate. 2. If you're interested in learning more about monastic education and its role in promoting spirituality and spiritual growth, be sure to check out some of the local organizations and initiatives that are working to preserve Bhutan's rich cultural heritage.
Mira, you're such a wonderful resource for our listeners, and I think that's something that our listeners would appreciate. 2. The importance of preserving traditional knowledge and cultural heritage is something that we can all learn from.
And finally, I'm curious to know more about the role of tourism in promoting spirituality and spiritual growth in Bhutan. I've heard that tourism is a growing industry in Bhutan, but it's also a challenge for the country's spiritual traditions.
Yes. Mira, tourism is a complex issue in Bhutan, particularly when it comes to spirituality and spiritual growth. But I think that's something that Trinidad and Tobago can learn from the importance of balancing economic development with cultural and spiritual preservation.
I completely agree. And I think that's something that our listeners would appreciate. 2. If you're interested in learning more about the role of tourism in promoting spirituality and spiritual growth in Bhutan, be sure to check out some of the local organizations and initiatives that are working to balance economic development with cultural and spiritual preservation.
Mira, you're such a wonderful guide for our listeners, and I think that's something that our listeners would appreciate. 2. The importance of balancing economic development with cultural and spiritual preservation is something that we can all learn from.
So, let's talk about social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago. I'm curious. Leo, what's your take on Bhutan's approach to social equality?
I think Bhutan's emphasis on gross national happiness is quite unique. It's not just about economic growth, but also about the well-being of the people and the environment.
Exactly. And I believe that's where Trinidad and Tobago comes in. They've made significant strides in promoting social equality and respect for minorities. In fact, they're one of the most culturally diverse countries in the Caribbean.
That's true. And I think it's interesting that both countries have a strong focus on community and social cohesion. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a vibrant carnival culture that celebrates their diverse heritage.
I love that. And Bhutan's festivals, like the Taxation, are a great example of how they bring their community together to celebrate their culture and traditions.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made efforts to address issues related to social inequality and minority rights. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they've implemented policies to promote equal access to education and healthcare.
That's so important. And I'm sure our listeners living in Trinidad and Tobago would agree with me that promoting social equality is a top priority.
I'm curious to hear from our listeners. Actually, what do you think about the role of social media in promoting social equality and respect for minorities in these countries?
That's a great question. Leo, I think social media can be a powerful tool for raising awareness and promoting social change. But it also has its limitations. In Bhutan, For example, they've implemented strict regulations on social media to protect their culture and traditions.
That's an interesting approach. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a strong tradition of community service and volunteerism.
I love that. And Bhutan's concept of gross national happiness is really about putting the well-being of the community and the environment first.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on education and personal development. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a strong emphasis on education and career development.
That's so important. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that education is key to promoting social equality and respect for minorities.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of cultural identity and heritage. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a rich cultural heritage that reflects their African, European, and indigenous influences.
I love that. And Bhutan's cultural heritage is also unique and fascinating. From their traditional architecture to their vibrant festivals, there's so much to explore and learn.
That's true. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a strong tradition of community service and volunteerism.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of tourism in promoting social equality and respect for minorities in these countries. What do you think? Leah?
That's a great question. Mia, I think tourism can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can promote cultural exchange and understanding. But on the other hand, it can also lead to cultural appropriation and disrespect for local traditions.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have implemented policies to regulate tourism and promote responsible tourism practices.
That's true. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of cultural identity and heritage. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a rich cultural heritage that reflects their African, European, and indigenous influences.
I love that. And Bhutan's cultural heritage is also unique and fascinating. From their traditional architecture to their vibrant festivals, there's so much to explore and learn.
That's true. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a strong tradition of community service and volunteerism.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Trinidad and Tobago would agree with me that promoting social equality is a top priority.
I'm curious to hear from our listeners. Actually, what do you think about the role of education in promoting social equality and respect for minorities in these countries?
That's a great question. Leo, I think education is key to promoting social equality and respect for minorities. In Bhutan, for example, they have a strong emphasis on education and personal development.
That's true. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of cultural identity and heritage. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a rich cultural heritage that reflects their African, European, and indigenous influences.
I love that. And Bhutan's cultural heritage is also unique and fascinating. From their traditional architecture to their vibrant festivals, there's so much to explore and learn.
That's true. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a strong tradition of community service and volunteerism.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of social media in promoting social equality and respect for minorities in these countries. What do you think? Leo?
That's a great question. Mira, I think social media can be a powerful tool for raising awareness and promoting social change. But it also has its limitations. In Bhutan, for example, they've implemented strict regulations on social media to protect their culture and traditions.
That's an interesting approach. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a strong tradition of community service and volunteerism.
That's true. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of cultural identity and heritage. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a rich cultural heritage that reflects their African, European, and indigenous influences.
I love that. And Bhutan's cultural heritage is also unique and fascinating. From their traditional architecture to their vibrant festivals, there's so much to explore and learn.
That's true. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, they have a strong tradition of community service and volunteerism.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Trinidad and Tobago would agree with me that promoting social equality is a top priority. To live into the fascinating world of taxation in Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago, I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to navigate the tax system in either country?
Actually, Mira, I have. And I must say it's a real adventure. In Bhutan, the government has a unique approach to taxation, where they aim to create a culture of generosity. They have a concept called giving back to the community, which I find quite admirable.
That's so cool. I've heard that Bhutan has a very low tax rate, and it's actually a way to encourage people to contribute to the community. But, Leo, I'm sure you know that Trinidad and Tobago has a more complex tax system.
Ah, yes. Trinidad and Tobago's tax system is indeed more complex, but it's also a reflection of its diverse economy and cultural influences. They have a range of tax incentives to attract foreign investment, which is great for businesses, but can be a challenge for individual taxpayers.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating tax laws can be a nightmare. But, Leo, have you heard about the tax-free zones in Trinidad and Tobago?
Oh, yes, I have. The tax-free zones are a great initiative to attract foreign investment and promote economic growth. But, Mira, I'm curious. How do you think Bhutan's tax system compares to Trinidad and Tobago's in terms of simplicity and ease of use?
Well, Leo, I think Bhutan's system is actually quite straightforward, especially for foreigners. They have a simple tax rate of 10% to 20%, and it's relatively easy to file taxes. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that simplicity is not always the best. And Trinidad and Tobago's tax system has its advantages too.
Ah, I see what you mean. And speaking of advantages, have you heard about the pension plans in Trinidad and Tobago? They have a great system for employees and employers to contribute to a pension fund.
Oh, yes, I have. The pension plans in Trinidad and Tobago are actually quite comprehensive, and it's a great way to ensure a secure retirement. But, Leo, I'm curious, how do you think Bhutan's pension plans compare to Trinidad and Tobago's?
Well, Mira, Bhutan's pension plans are actually quite limited, especially for foreigners. They have a small pension scheme, but it's not as comprehensive as Trinidad and Tobago's. But I think it's worth noting that Bhutan has a strong focus on social welfare and community support, which is reflected in their pension plans.
I see what you mean. And speaking of social welfare, have you heard about the social safety nets in Trinidad and Tobago? They have a great system of support for vulnerable populations, including the elderly and the disabled.
Ah, yes, I have. The social safety nets in Trinidad and Tobago are actually quite impressive, and it's a great example of how a country can prioritize the well-being of its citizens. But, Mira, I'm curious. How do you think Bhutan's social safety nets compare to Trinidad and Tobago's?
Well, Leo, I think Bhutan's social safety nets are actually quite limited, especially for foreigners. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that social welfare is an important aspect of any country's social fabric. And, Leo, I'm curious. What do you think is the most important aspect of taxation? Retirement and social rights for long-term immigrants?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, I think the most important aspect is actually the sense of community and belonging that comes with being a part of a country's social fabric, whether it's through taxation, retirement plans, or social safety nets. I think it's essential for long-term immigrants to feel like they're part of the community.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that feeling part of a community is essential for a happy and fulfilling life. Thanks for sharing your insights. Leo!
Thanks. Mira, it's been a pleasure discussing taxation, retirement, and social rights with you.
So, let's dive into the world of specific interests and see how Boot and Trinidad and Tobago to enthusiasts. I'm curious to know. Leo, what kind of unique events do you think Bhutan would host to meet the interests of its visitors?
Bhutan is known for its vibrant festivals and events, like the Parotishichu, which is a masked dance festival. It's an incredible display of traditional music, dance, and culture.
Well, that sounds fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to experience something like that. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How do they meet the interests of their visitors?
Trinidad and Tobago is a melting pot of cultures, and their events reflect that. They have the Carnival, which is a massive celebration of music, dance, and costumes.
Ooh, I've heard of the Carnival. It's a famous event. I'm sure our listeners would love to attend something like that. Speaking of unique events, I've heard that Bhutan has a festival dedicated to the national sport, archery.
Yes. The Archery Festival is a big deal in Bhutan. It's a great way to showcase the country's passion for archery and provide entertainment for visitors.
That's so cool. I'm sure our listeners would love to see a traditional archery competition. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How do they cater to interests of their visitors when it comes to sports?
Trinidad and Tobago has a strong focus on sports, especially cricket and soccer. They have a number of sports facilities and events that showcase these sports, including the Queen's Park Oval Cricket Stadium.
Oh, I've heard of that stadium. It's a world-renowned venue. I'm sure our listeners would love to attend a cricket match or a soccer game there. So, let's talk about community engagement. I'm sure our listeners would love to know how Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago foster a sense of community among their residents and visitors. In Bhutan, I've heard that they have a strong emphasis on community service and volunteer work.
Yes. Bhutan has a strong tradition of community service and volunteer work. Many visitors participate in these activities, which helps to foster a sense of community and social responsibility.
That's so wonderful. I'm sure our listeners would love to participate in something like that. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How do they engage their community?
Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago has a number of community programs and events that bring people together. For example, they have the Tobago Heritage Festival, which celebrates the island's history and culture.
Ooh, I heard of that festival. It's a great way to learn about the island's heritage. I'm sure our listeners would love to attend something like that. So, let's talk about niche hobby clubs. I'm sure our listeners would love to know about the unique hobby clubs that Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have to offer. In Bhutan, I've heard that they have a number of traditional art and craft clubs.
Yes. Bhutan has a strong emphasis on traditional arts and crafts. Many visitors participate in these clubs, which helps to preserve the country's cultural heritage.
That's so cool! I'm sure our listeners would love to learn about these traditional arts and crafts. But what about Trinidad and Tobago? How do they cater to the interests of their visitors when it comes to hobbies?
Trinidad and Tobago has a number of hobby clubs and organizations that cater to a wide range of interests. For example, they have the Trinidad and Tobago Philatelic Society, which is dedicated to the study and collection of stamps.
Ooh, I've heard of that society. It's a great way to learn about philately. I'm sure our listeners would love to attend a meeting or event hosted by that society. Well, it looks like we're running out of time. But I just want to say that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago have so much to offer when it comes to meeting specific interests. From unique events and community engagement to niche hobby clubs. There's something for everyone in these two countries. Thanks for joining us on this comparison podcast. And we'll see you in the next one.
It was a pleasure chatting with you. Mira, I think our listeners would agree that both Bhutan and Trinidad and Tobago are amazing destinations for anyone looking to explore their interests. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
And don't forget to follow the Jet Off AI YouTube channel for more episodes like this. Hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop and be among the first to listen. We'd love for you to share your thoughts, comments, and critiques below. Reading and responding to them truly brightens our day. Thanks for joining us.
Warmest wishes from us. See you in the next one.